What's up, guys? Welcome to Vision Harry. We've got something special today. What if every dragon in world felt Harry's abuse at age 6 and dragon nations declared Dumbledore enemy of all magical creatures? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1, The Trembling. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive smelled like dust and old shoes and the particular kind of silence that comes from being forgotten. Harry Potter was 6 years old today. He knew it was his birthday because he'd counted the days on a scratch he'd made in the baseboard with a bent nail, 31 scratches since the last time Aunt Petunia had mentioned, in that clipped, dismissive way of hers, that Dudley's birthday was coming up and they'd need to start planning. That had been the 1st of June. So today, the 31st of July, was his. Not that it changed anything. The cupboard was still dark. The single crack of light under the door still showed the same sliver of hallway carpet, worn thin where Uncle Vernon's feet always turned toward the kitchen. The scratching of Dudley's television still filtered through the ceiling above him, some cartoon with a lot of explosions that Dudley had already watched twice. Harry sat with his back against the wall and his knees pulled to his chest and thought about the word birthday and tried to figure out why it was supposed to mean something. He was hungry. That was the most concrete thing about the day. He'd had half a piece of toast that morning, the burnt end Aunt Petunia hadn't wanted, and nothing since. It was past dark now. He could tell by the way the light under the door had gone from yellow to orange to the bluish nothing of the hallway lamp being clicked off for the evening. The Dursleys had gone to bed. The house had that specific settled weight feeling it got when no one was moving through it. His ribs hurt on the left side. They'd been hurting since 2 days ago when Uncle Vernon had grabbed him by the back of his shirt and thrown him against the kitchen counter because he'd broken a plate, not dropped it, not smashed it carelessly, but broken it trying to carry too many at once because he'd been told to clear the table faster. The edge of the counter had caught him exactly wrong. He'd bitten the inside of his cheek to keep from making a sound, because making a sound made things worse. He was good at not making sounds. He sat in the dark on his birthday and breathed carefully around the ache in his ribs and thought about the crack of light under the door. He thought about the fact that outside that door was a hallway, and outside the hallway was a street, and outside the street was a world that was apparently full of things, trees and birds and wind and rain and people moving around in it, and none of it knew or cared that he was here. He wasn't angry about that. Anger was a thing that cost energy and energy was something he was always running short on. He just noted it the way he noted most things, with that flat, cataloging attention he developed the way other children developed hobbies. His scar itched. It did that sometimes. The lightning bolt scar on his forehead that no one had ever explained to him, except that he'd had it since the car crash that killed his parents, which was itself a story he'd always felt was slightly wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. He reached up and pressed 2 fingers against it in the dark, and for a moment the itch intensified into something that wasn't quite pain, more like pressure, like something pushing from the inside out. Then it faded. Harry lowered his hand. Outside the cupboard, the house was silent. He didn't know it yet, but at that exact moment, every dragon in the world had just screamed. The cliff at the edge of the Snowdonia Range had no name on any Muggle map. It jutted out over a valley that existed in a permanent state of low cloud and mineral gray light, the kind of place that felt older than the human concept of old, older than the stones themselves, older than the names people had given to mountains. The dragons had been here longer than the Druids, longer than the Romans who had marched past the valley's edge and felt something watching them from the high rocks and wisely kept walking. There was a particular shelf of granite, worn smooth on its upper surface by centuries of scaled weight, where Scarif liked to sit when the weather was coming in from the west. He was sitting there now, and the thing that had just moved through him like a wave through deep water had left him very, very still. Scarif was not young by any measure. He had watched 5 centuries pass from cliffs like this one. He had felt the rise and fall of wars, the slow churn of the magical world's politics, the particular texture of grief and triumph that moved through the air when something enormous happened somewhere on the earth. He was the eldest of the surviving Welsh Greens, though by now he was something older and stranger than a breed name suggested, a creature that had accumulated so much time that he'd gone past the point where time meant what it meant to shorter-lived things. His scales were the color of deep forest shadow. His eyes, half-lidded against the wind, were the gold of very old amber. What had just moved through him was not a weather event or a magical discharge or a death. It was a child. He sat with it for a long moment, parsing the sensation the way one parses an unexpected sound, trying to locate its source, its quality, its meaning. What he had felt was pain. That was the simple word for it, but the word was inadequate in the way a candle is inadequate to describe a fire. It had been layered pain, physical, yes, the hot sharp signature of recent injury, but under that the deeper and more corrosive kind, the slow erosion of a child who has been systematically taught that they are worth nothing, that their hunger is an imposition, that their voice is a nuisance, that their existence is something to be managed rather than celebrated. That kind of pain had a different quality than the acute kind. It was the pain of a thing being hollowed out over years. And beneath both of those things, beneath the physical hurt and the erosion, something else entirely. Something that Scareth had not felt in a very long time. Not since he had been young, and the world had been different, and the beings who carried that particular resonance had walked openly. Old magic. The deep kind. The kind that predated wandwork in schools and the polite, hedged way the wizarding world had come to think about power. It burned in the child like a coal under ash, compressed, contained, enormous, absolutely unconscious of itself. The child didn't know what they carried. The child was just sitting somewhere dark and hurting and being 6 years old on a birthday that no one was marking. The wave had gone out in all directions. He had felt it, all of them had felt it, as a simultaneous pulse, the way you feel a thunderclap in your chest. Every dragon in the world. He knew this without needing to confirm it. The resonance had that quality of total breadth, the feeling of something that had hit every point on a sphere at once. Scareth exhaled slowly. The breath came out as a thin line of smoke that the wind immediately took apart. He had not declared political opinions in many decades. He had watched the wizarding world manage its creatures with the benign contempt of people who have decided that something is lesser and no longer bother to examine the assumption. He had watched the reserves, the careful, well-intentioned cages with better food and a wider sky, which were still cages. He had watched dragons taken from their territories, catalogued, studied, their eggs harvested for uses their parents were never asked to consent to. He had watched it all with the particular exhaustion of something very old that has learned that the world moves at its own pace and does not much appreciate being hurried. But this. A child. Alone. Hurt. And carrying old fire that the wizarding world had apparently decided to leave in a cupboard under a staircase. Scareth turned his head toward the east, toward the precise direction the pulse had come from. He could feel it still, not the wave, which had passed, but the source, the way you can still feel the warmth from a fire long after the flame has been covered. Somewhere in that direction, in a small house in the south of England, a child was sitting in the dark on their birthday. He thought about Dumbledore. He had met the man once, briefly, at a summit 20 years ago that had been called to discuss the rights of magical creatures and had concluded with a very elegant set of promises that no one had kept. He remembered the impression of great intelligence, greater charm, and a quality that Scareth had catalogued at the time and filed away, the absolute certainty of a man who has decided that his judgment supersedes the judgment of everyone around him. Not from arrogance exactly. Arrogance was simple and easy to oppose. This was something more dangerous, the serene confidence of a person who has decided they are good, and therefore all their choices are good, and therefore questioning those choices is, at the root of it, a kind of ingratitude. He had placed the child there. Scareth had not been certain of this 5 minutes ago. He was certain now. The child's pain had a particular signature, not accidental suffering, not the chaos of random misfortune, but the specific, grinding quality of suffering that has been arranged. Someone had chosen that house. Someone had chosen those people. And the old fire in that child, it had been in the world for 6 years and not one person with the standing to see it had appeared to do anything about it. He got to his feet. His claws found the old familiar purchase on the granite shelf. Below him the valley was lost in cloud. There was a summit being arranged. He knew this because the pulse had gone out to every dragon and every dragon was now, in their various ways, responding. He could feel the shape of it at the edge of his awareness, the roiling, collective outrage of his kind, who were not gentle creatures and did not process the harm of children with anything like human restraint. The Romanian colonies alone would be volcanic. The Chinese fireballs had an ancient and specific law about the harming of magical children that predated the statute of secrecy by 2,000 years. The African dragons, the ones the wizarding world had never properly catalogued and generally pretended not to know about, had a word for what had just been communicated to them that translated, roughly, as a call to answer. He would go to that summit. He would speak, and he would be heard. But first he needed to know more about this child. He turned toward the dark horizon and thought about the lightning-shaped scar, which he had felt in the pulse as clearly as a physical brand, and he thought about the name that was attached to it, which moved in the old magic like a stone in still water, and he thought about what it meant that the boy who had survived Voldemort was sitting in a cupboard getting his ribs broken by muggles. The wind picked up. Below him the valley breathed. 5 years, he thought. He would give the boy 5 years to grow. And then he would come. The Romanian Dragon Reserve at Dumpling Hill spread across 200 hectares of warded mountain terrain and housed, on the night of July 31st, 83 dragons across 6 species. Charlie Weasley had been working there for 8 months and had not yet entirely gotten used to the sound of 8 dragons on the east slope all exhaling simultaneously, which was the sound currently happening outside the window of the staff common room, accompanied by a vibration in the stone floor that his tea was registering as tiny circular ripples. "Marta," he said carefully, not moving his eyes from the window. "Are they?" "Yes," said Marta Kozlow, the senior keeper, who was already on her feet and pulling on her coat with the practiced urgency of someone who has had many bad nights in this job. "All of them. Every single dragon on the reserve." Charlie went to the window. In the torchlight that lined the perimeter walls he could see the nearest enclosure, 3 Romanian longhorns who were supposed to be asleep at this hour, standing with their heads raised toward the northwest, completely motionless, their breath coming in short steam clouds. They weren't distressed, he realized. They weren't preparing to attack or defend. They were, he searched for the word, listening. They were all listening to something, their enormous bodies oriented in the same direction with the focused stillness of creatures that have received a signal. "What direction is that?" he said. Marta was already checking her compass. "West-northwest." She looked up at him. "Britain." Charlie pressed his hand flat against the glass. He'd been around dragons long enough to develop a feel for their moods, a rough translation instinct that all the good keepers developed, the difference between territorial aggression and hunger, between a creature that wants you to leave and a creature that wants you dead. What he was feeling now, radiating off every dragon in the reserve like heat off coals, was something he'd never felt from them before. Grief, he thought, and then immediately dismissed it, because dragons didn't grieve in ways that humans were meant to notice. Then he thought, no. Not grief. Something that would become grief if it was allowed to, but hadn't tipped over yet. Something that was currently being held in the space between receiving a wound and deciding what to do about it. "Send a message to the reserve in Wales," Marta said, pulling on her second glove. "And to the French colony. Find out if, it'll be the same," said one of the other keepers, a taciturn Slovakian man named Pavel who was standing in the doorway with his coat already on. He said it with absolute certainty, as if he'd already checked. "It will be the same everywhere." Something happened. "What happened?" Charlie said. Pavel looked at him with an expression that somehow communicated a vast and complicated thought in very few words. "Something that shouldn't have," he said simply. Charlie turned back to the window. The longhorns were still motionless, still oriented northwest, their amber eyes catching the torchlight and throwing it back. He thought about what was northwest of here, what specifically northwest, and his mind landed on Britain and then on nothing specific because he didn't yet have the information that would make the specific thing obvious. He wouldn't have it for 5 years. But later, when he did, he would remember this night with perfect clarity, the tea going cold on the table, the stone floor vibrating, the dragons standing in the dark like monuments to something that hadn't happened yet, and he would understand what he'd been feeling radiating off them was not grief and not rage and not even the beginning of a declaration. It was the moment 83 dragons, and every dragon like them across the whole of the world, made a decision. Back in the cupboard, Harry had fallen asleep. He did that sometimes in the middle of thinking, just dropped off, the way you do when your body has been running on not enough of everything for long enough that sleep stops being a choice and starts being a seizure of the involuntary kind. He was curled on his side on the thin mattress that had been Dudley's old one, with his knees still pulled up and his left arm folded under his head. He dreamed of fire, which was not unusual. He dreamed of fire a lot, not the frightening kind, not the crackling destructive kind that you were supposed to be afraid of, but fire the way fire feels when you're cold and it's the most welcome thing in the world. Fire that was, somehow, aware of him. That turned toward him the way a dog turns toward a familiar voice. In the dream he was standing on a cliff in the dark and the fire was all around him and he was not afraid at all, not even a little, and everything hurt less. He slept with his hand pressed flat against the lightning bolt scar. 3,000 miles away, in a mountain range that didn't appear on any Muggle map, an ancient dragon with amber eyes sat on a granite shelf and watched the eastern horizon and kept a count in his head that had just begun. Day 1. The boy was 6 years old. He would come when the boy was 11. 5 years was nothing to a creature who had already lived 5 centuries. But it felt, in the way that necessary waiting always feels, very long. Scareth folded his wings and sat in the dark and let the wind take his breath apart, and somewhere below him in the valley a younger dragon cried out, a short, sharp sound, and then went silent, the way you go silent when you've said the necessary thing and there's nothing left to add. The night moved on around them, indifferent and old. In the cupboard under the stairs, Harry Potter slept through his 6th birthday and did not dream about the darkness or the pain or the careful measured hunger that was his daily reality. He dreamed about fire and cliffs and the feeling of being seen by something enormous, and in the dream the enormous thing looked at him with amber eyes and did not look away. He didn't wake up different. 6-year-olds don't work that way. But something had shifted in the old magic under his skin, a very slight realignment, the way a compass needle moves when the Earth's field changes, and when he opened his eyes in the morning to the familiar dark of the cupboard and the familiar crack of light under the door, he felt, for the first time in his life, the specific and inexplicable sensation of being waited for. He didn't have a word for it. He was 6. But it sat in his chest warm and strange and entirely unlike anything that had ever lived there before, and he pressed his fingers to his scar where it had stopped itching entirely, and he thought about the dream and the fire and the amber eyes, and he thought, something knows I'm here. He held that thought like the bent nail he kept in his pocket. A small hard thing with a use he hadn't found yet. Outside, the summer morning was beginning. He could hear birds, and the specific sound of the neighborhood waking up, lawnmowers and car doors and the distant voices of children who were allowed to be outside on summer mornings. In a while Aunt Petunia would open the cupboard door and tell him to start breakfast. The day would proceed in its familiar shape. But he would carry the warm strange thing in his chest through it, and it would not leave him, and 5 years from now he would understand why. The world had taken note. He simply didn't know it yet. By morning, every dragon reserve on 6 continents had filed an emergency communication. The messages arrived at the British Ministry of Magic's Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures at approximately 7 in the morning, routed through the Creature Liaison Office, which was staffed at that hour by a single very bored junior official named Thaddeus Bunt, who read the first 3 communications, turned them over as if looking for additional context on the back, and then walked very quickly to the office of his supervisor. His supervisor read them. Then read them again. The communications were not identical, they came from reserves in Romania, Wales, China, Egypt, Australia, Brazil, and 4 other locations, but they were, in their essence, the same message. Every dragon on every reserve had experienced what the Welsh keeper described as a simultaneous empathic transmission of profound distress. The Romanian report used the phrase collective resonance event. The Chinese reserve, whose documentation was always the most precise, described a coordinated and intentional pulse of suffering originating from a single magical source, identity, juvenile, location, Southeast England, approximate age, 6 years. The Chinese communication also included, at the end, a sentence that Bunt's supervisor read 3 times before putting the document down and staring at the wall. The source is known to our records. We have been aware of the residual signature since November 1981. We named it then. We are naming it again now. We will be seeking answers. Bunt's supervisor went directly to his own supervisor, and by 9 in the morning the documents had moved up 3 levels of the ministry hierarchy to an undersecretary who read them, made several calculations about how politically inconvenient this would be, and sent a single memo to the office of the chief warlock of the Waisengamot. The memo was marked, for attention, Dumbledore. Urgent, Dragon Nations event, possible political implications, recommend review. It sat in a pile of correspondence on a desk in an office on the 7th floor of the ministry for 9 days before it was opened. When it was opened, the man who read it sat very still for a very long moment, and then set it aside and went back to the letter he'd been writing, and the expression on his face was not surprise. He had known, roughly, that something like this was possible. He had calculated the odds and considered the risks and decided, as he decided most things, that the necessity outweighed the cost. The boy had to be there. The protection required the conditions to be what they were, not just the blood, but the intent, the active presence of family, and family required a particular kind of relationship that required a particular kind of living arrangement. He had done the arithmetic and the arithmetic had come out the same every time. The dragons were a complication. He was not, however, a man who was unequal to complications. He was, in fact, rather accustomed to being the most capable person in any room, and to finding, over time, that complications had a way of resolving themselves when the person managing them was sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently patient. He set the memo aside. He picked up his quill. He continued writing his letter, which was to a potions researcher in Edinburgh and concerned a completely unrelated matter. The morning continued around him, orderly and bright. 5 years, he thought, which was the same number Scarith was thinking on his cliff at the same moment, though for entirely opposite reasons. 5 years and the boy would come to Hogwarts. And then everything would proceed as planned. In the forbidden forest at the edge of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where the trees grew close and the light went grey-green at midday and things moved in the undergrowth that the care of magical creatures textbooks hadn't gotten around to classifying yet, a centaur named Bane stood at the tree-line and looked up at the sky. He had been watching the stars since before dawn and the stars had told him the same thing several ways, the way stars do when they need you to understand something you're inclined to resist. He stood there for a long time after the sun came up, turning it over. Then he went into the forest and found his herd and told them what was coming, not the specifics, because stars don't give specifics, they give shapes, trajectories, the broad arc of what will be. And what would be, he told them, was this: something old was waking up. Something that had been patient for a very long time. And it was coming here, eventually, and when it arrived, a great many carefully constructed things were going to come apart at their seams. He said this without satisfaction or fear. He was a centaur and he had been reading the sky his entire life and the sky did not ask for his feelings about what it told him. It simply told him. His herd listened and then went back to what they'd been doing, because the sky had been telling them large things were coming for a very long time and the forest still needed tending in the meantime. Bane stayed at the tree-line a moment longer. He thought about the school behind him, its towers catching the morning light, its grounds quiet in the early summer before any students arrived. He thought about the man who ran it, the man whose presence Bane had always felt at the edge of the forest the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not malevolent. Not exactly. Something more complex than that. He thought about the stars. He turned and walked back into the forest and did not look at the school again. Above Privet Drive, 300 miles south, a single hawk that was not a hawk circled once and then oriented itself toward Wales and flew. Harry woke up to Aunt Petunia banging on the cupboard door. "Up," she said, in the tone she always used, which had the quality of a word that had been stripped of every implication except its function. Not cruel, exactly. Not even angry. Just the specific sound of a person speaking to something they've decided is a task rather than a person. He got up. His ribs hurt. He put that in the background where he kept things that were true but not useful to think about. He pulled on the oversized hand-me-down shirt that had been Dudley's when Dudley was 9 and was now Harry's daily uniform, and he opened the cupboard door and stepped out into the hallway. The house smelled like bacon and coffee, which were not for him. He went to the kitchen and started making breakfast. He was very precise about breakfast, efficient in the way he'd had to become efficient, no wasted movements, no spills, nothing that could be pointed to as error. He cracked eggs without breaking the yolks unless asked. He timed the bacon by the smell and the sound rather than the clock because the kitchen clock was positioned where Aunt Petunia could see it and he couldn't. He made toast in the right quantity and arranged it the right way and had everything on the table by the time Uncle Vernon's heavy footsteps on the stairs signaled the household's official beginning. Dudley came down and immediately knocked Harry's elbow on his way to his chair, not hard, just a habitual jostle, the kind of contact that wouldn't leave a mark and wasn't technically anything but that had the quality of a territorial gesture. Harry stepped sideways and kept his hand steady and didn't react. He ate standing at the counter. Half a piece of toast. The burnt end, again. Through the kitchen window the summer morning looked exactly the same as it always did, the neighbor's sprinkler going, 2 houses down, the sound of a car reversing out of a driveway, the specific suburban English calm of a street that contained, somewhere in one of its houses, a child living in the particular dark that no one on the street was thinking about. Harry stood at the kitchen counter and ate his half-piece of toast and looked out the window and felt, very quietly, the warm strange thing from the dream still sitting in his chest. Something knows I'm here. The sprinkler went on turning. Dudley asked for more bacon. Uncle Vernon made a comment about the neighbor's lawn. Harry chewed his toast and thought about fire and amber eyes and waited, with the patient precision of someone who has learned to treat time as a resource to be managed, for whatever was going to happen next. 5 years, something very far away was thinking. Harry didn't know about the 5 years yet. But he was, in the way that children are sometimes capable of being, already ready for them. Chapter 2, The Declaration. The Dragon Summit took place in a valley that existed in 3 countries simultaneously. This was not a geographical accident. The valley sat at the convergence point of old ley lines, the kind that predated border drawing by several thousand years and had always produced, in the humans who wandered into them, a strong instinctive feeling that they should keep walking. It was nestled in the high Alps, above the tree-line, in a bowl of grey rock and permanent snow that no Muggle hiking map had ever correctly charted. The statute of secrecy didn't apply to places that no Muggle had ever thought to look for. The dragons came from everywhere. They came over 3 days, arriving in waves that the mountain felt as changes in pressure, the air thickening, the temperature shifting, the specific electrical quality of the atmosphere that accumulated when large numbers of ancient magical creatures occupied a space that wasn't built for them. They came from Romania and Wales and the Hebrides and China and Egypt and the deep southern territories that the wizarding world had always been careful not to look at too directly. They came from islands and inland ranges and coastal cliffs and the particular thermal currents over the Sahara that certain breeds had been riding for millennia without interruption. Scarith arrived first, as was appropriate. He found his place on the highest flat rock in the valley and settled there and watched the others come in with the unhurried attention of something that has arranged a great many difficult gatherings in its time. There was no agenda. Dragons didn't work from agendas. There was the thing that had happened and the thing that needed to be decided, and every dragon that arrived already knew both of those things because they'd been living with them for 5 years, the way a wound lives in a body, not bleeding anymore, not acute, but there, present, altering the way everything else feels. 5 years of knowing that a child was in that house. 5 years of Scarith counseling patience, because the boy needed to grow, and because a declaration made in the first hours of outrage would be a declaration made badly, and because if they were going to take this to the wizarding world's institutions they needed to be right and precise and unimpeachable, which required time and evidence and the cold clarity that came after the fire had been allowed to settle. The other dragons had waited. Not happily. Not without cost. But they had waited. Scareth stood on his rock and watched a pair of Chinese fireballs land on the eastern ridge, their scales catching the mountain light like copper coals, and thought that 5 years was probably the most restraint his kind had shown collectively in recorded history. It was enough. They were done waiting. The formal declaration took 4 hours and was conducted in the old tongue, which had no wizarding equivalent and which humans who had occasionally witnessed portions of it described as a sound like the earth deciding something. The substance of it was this: Albus Dumbledore, chief warlock of the Wizengamot, supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, and headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, had knowingly placed a child of significant magical heritage, a child whom every dragon on Earth had identified as carrying old fire, deep magic, the particular resonance that the magical world had, in its various traditions, called by many names, all of which meant the same thing, into a situation of deliberate, sustained abuse. He had done this with full knowledge of what he was doing and had maintained it for 6 years after the dragons had made their awareness known through channels that could not have been missed by anyone paying attention. The declaration named him enemy of all magical creatures. This was not a legal designation in wizarding law. The dragons were not particularly interested in wizarding law. In their own law, which was older and considerably less forgiving, enemy of all magical creatures carried specific consequences. It meant that no dragon would cooperate with, assist, or defer to the named individual in any capacity. It meant that every dragon-adjacent institution, the reserves, the keepers, the breeders, the researchers who worked with draconic materials, was notified and their cooperation with the enemy was considered a secondary violation. It meant that the declaration would be transmitted to every non-human magical species through the old channels that predated the Ministry of Magic by roughly 8 centuries. The centaurs received it before the echo had finished leaving the valley. So did the mere people, and the giants' remaining tribal leaders, and the communities of beings that occupied the spaces between what wizarding taxonomy had decided to call creatures and beings, the goblins most prominently among them. The goblins, when they received it, had a meeting that lasted 30 minutes, which by goblin standards was essentially instantaneous, and sent back a message that translated into English as, "We have been aware of this situation. We are glad someone said it properly. We will be watching." The centaurs sent nothing back. They didn't need to. Bane had already read it in the stars 5 years ago. The Ministry of Magic received official notification of the Dragon Declaration on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered not through the standard interspecies communication channels but as a direct physical document, a slate of grey mountain stone inscribed in both the old tongue and precise English, deposited overnight at the security desk of the ministry's main atrium by means that no one had seen and the security footage had somehow failed to capture. Cornelius Fudge read it 3 times in his office with the door locked. He was not a stupid man. People thought he was a stupid man, which was partly his own fault for affecting the kind of bluff, cheerful accessibility that read as simple to people who confused sophistication with intelligence. He understood exactly what he was reading. He understood the political weight of it and the practical implications and the specific problem it created, which was this: the dragon nations had just publicly declared one of the most powerful and politically connected wizards in Britain to be their enemy, and they had done it not through diplomacy but through the dragon equivalent of nailing something to a door, and now he, Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, who had been in office for 3 years and was planning to be in office for 30 more, had to decide what to do about it. The problem was not the declaration itself. The problem was the reason for it. He'd had the Chinese Reserve's original communication, the one from 5 years ago, the one that said the source is known to our records, pulled from the archives when he first heard about this summit. He'd read it. He'd pulled everything adjacent to it, every communication from every reserve that referenced the event of July 31st, 11 years ago, and everything that followed. He'd spent a long evening reading, and at the end of the evening he'd sat in his chair with a glass of fire whiskey and looked at his desk and thought about Albus Dumbledore. He thought about what it would cost to challenge Albus Dumbledore. He thought about what it would cost not to. He called his secretary in and told her he needed an emergency meeting with Dumbledore at his earliest convenience, and then he looked at the stone declaration on his desk and had the distinct feeling of a man watching a crack appear in the foundation of something he'd always assumed was solid. In Surrey, on a perfectly ordinary Thursday morning, Harry Potter was 11 years old and making breakfast. 5 years had not made Privet Drive different. The same sprinkler, 2 houses down. The same car reversing from the same driveway. The same precise calibrations of what to say and not say, what to do and not do, how to navigate the particular domestic architecture of a house where he was simultaneously indispensable and unwelcome. What 5 years had done was make Harry different. He was still quiet. That hadn't changed. But the quality of the quiet had shifted. It was less the quiet of someone making themselves small and more the quiet of someone who had decided that noise was generally a waste of energy. He moved through the Dursley household with a contained, economical stillness that occasionally made Aunt Petunia uncomfortable in ways she couldn't articulate and therefore expressed as increased criticism about the state of the garden. He was also, though no one at number 4 had gotten around to noticing it, considerably more formidable than they were accounting for. Not in a way that showed easily. He wasn't large, he was still slight, still wearing hand-me-down clothes that didn't fit, still sporting the round glasses that had been taped at the hinge for 8 months because no one had replaced them. But there was something about the way he held himself, some quality of absolute unflappability, that had been there since he was 6 and had been solidifying ever since. Dudley had largely stopped bullying him directly somewhere around age 9, without being able to explain why. It wasn't that Harry had done anything. It was that the experience of trying to bully someone who looked at you with total calm interest, as if you were a mildly educational phenomenon, gradually stopped being satisfying. Uncle Vernon still occasionally exploded in his direction. Harry had learned to stand in exactly the right way during these explosions, present, attentive, neither cringing nor defiant, and the explosions tended to run out of fuel faster when they didn't get the reaction they were calibrated for. He knew things were coming. He'd known for a while. He didn't know the specifics, but the warm strange thing in his chest that had started on his 6th birthday had been getting louder for months, and he'd learned to trust it the way he trusted the instinct that told him when something in the house was about to break before it broke, a different quality of sound, a different quality of silence. He stood at the stove and turned the bacon and did not think about it too hard, because thinking too hard at something had a way of making it shy away. He just let it be there, warm and certain and building, and waited. He didn't have to wait much longer. The letter arrived with the morning post on a Friday. Harry didn't see it arrive. He saw it in Dudley's hand. Dudley had gotten to the door first, as always, and had sorted the post by the system Aunt Petunia had taught him years ago, bills to the kitchen table, catalogues to the side table, anything else to Uncle Vernon's study. But Dudley wasn't moving. He was standing in the hallway with the post in one hand and a thick cream-colored envelope in the other, turning it over with the expression of someone holding something that has made them vaguely uneasy. "What's that?" Harry said. Dudley looked up. He had the expression he got when he'd been surprised by something and hadn't decided how to process it yet. "Letter for you," he said. Harry set down the spatula. A letter for him was, historically, a thing that did not happen. He had received precisely no personal correspondence in his 11 years of life, because there was no one who knew he existed in a way that would prompt them to write. He crossed the hallway and looked at the envelope in Dudley's hand without taking it, and he read the address, Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He stood very still for a moment. The cupboard under the stairs. Whoever had written this knew exactly where he slept. They had written it down on an official-looking envelope with a wax seal. He could see the red crest from here, and they had not written the smallest bedroom or the Dursleys' residence or any of the comfortable fictions that might be extended. They had written the truth. The exact, specific, carefully observed truth. He took the envelope from Dudley, who relinquished it without a fight, which was itself unusual. He was still reading the address when Uncle Vernon's voice came from the kitchen. "Post here yet?" Harry put the letter in his pocket. He didn't fully understand why he did it. Instinct, mostly, the same instinct that had kept him alive in this house for 11 years. Something about that envelope felt important in a way that required him to be alone with it before it was seen by anyone else. He went back to the kitchen and finished breakfast and distributed it to the family and ate his own small portion standing up, and the whole time the envelope sat in the front pocket of his oversized jeans and nobody asked about it. He read it in the garden, crouching behind the shed where the lawnmower lived. The seal was an H over a shield divided into 4 sections. He broke it carefully and unfolded 3 pages of heavy parchment. By the time he was done reading, several things had rearranged themselves in his head with the efficient precision of someone who has been waiting for information and is now sorting it rapidly into existing categories. He was a wizard. He had a school. He had a place in a world he hadn't known about. He looked up from the parchment at the garden, at the extremely ordinary garden with its extremely ordinary shed and the neighbor's fence and the sound of the sprinkler, 2 houses down, going round and round, and he thought, I knew something was coming. This is probably not all of it. He was right. That night, very late, when the house had gone through all its usual sounds and settled into the specific silence of 3 people asleep, Harry lay on his back in the cupboard. He had graduated to the smallest bedroom briefly at age 8, following an incident involving a teacher's wig and what had officially been attributed to a freak wind, but had been returned to the cupboard within a month after another incident that Uncle Vernon still couldn't bring himself to fully describe, and looked at the dark ceiling and listened. Not with his ears. With the thing in his chest. It was very loud tonight. He'd noticed it getting louder across the day, building from the moment he'd held the letter, reaching a pitch after dark that he could almost hear. It felt like, he searched for comparison and found nothing that fit exactly except maybe the feeling before a storm, the pressure change feeling, when the air goes heavy and still and you know something large is about to happen. He wasn't afraid of it. He'd stopped being afraid of things he couldn't name at approximately age 7, on the grounds that there were enough things he could name to occupy whatever fear he had available. He was just waiting. The clock in the hallway marked midnight. The house breathed around him. Then something tapped at the small high window of the cupboard, the one that he could open from the inside if he stood on his mattress. Not a knock. A tap. Precise, intentional, with a specific quality to it that made him sit up immediately. He stood on the mattress and pushed the latch and swung the window inward. The night air came in, cool and smelling of summer and cut grass and something underneath both of those things that he didn't have a name for, wild and old and electrical, like the air right after lightning. He looked out. The street was empty. The orange glow of street lamps fell on the parked cars and the pavement and the identical garden walls. Nothing moved. Then he looked up. The sky over Privet Drive was clear, stars, and the thin bright edge of a half-moon, and the ordinary dark. And sitting on the roof of the house directly across the street, folded so still and tight that he'd almost missed them against the shadows, a pair of amber eyes looked back at him. Harry went completely still. The thing on the roof was large. He could see that now that he was looking, the outline of it against the sky, the folded wings pressed flat in a way that compressed the silhouette but not entirely, the long neck that was currently horizontal and at street level was probably taller than the house. It was a dragon. He had never seen a dragon and he knew with absolute certainty that it was a dragon, the way you know certain things without the chain of evidence. They looked at each other for a moment. Then the dragon moved, a single controlled shift of weight that brought its head lower, closer, level with his window. It was a measure of how far Harry's sense of normal had drifted from typical 11-year-old parameters that his primary response to a dragon's head being 6 feet from his face was not to shout. The amber eyes were extraordinary. They held a quality he'd never seen in any animal's eyes before, not quite human and not quite animal and something else entirely, something ancient that had thought about the world for such a long time that it had developed opinions about it. The dragon looked at him. Then it spoke. Not in English. Not in words that landed in his ears. In something that landed somewhere behind his eyes and in his chest simultaneously, which had the feeling of words the way music has the feeling of words, carrying meaning without the mechanism. I told them I would come when you were ready. Harry pressed his fingers to his scar without thinking. It was warm. Not painful, warm. You've been waiting, he said. Not a question. 5 years. Since my birthday. Since you were 6 and every dragon in the world felt what was being done to you. The summer air moved between them, carrying the old electrical smell. Harry looked at the amber eyes and thought about the dream he'd had on that birthday, fire and cliffs and something enormous looking at him without looking away, and thought about the feeling he'd carried since then, the warm strange certainty of being waited for, and thought about how many times over 5 years he'd looked out from behind the shed or from the window of the smallest bedroom at the sky and felt something out there, patient and enormous, turning in his direction. He thought about the Hogwarts letter in his pocket and the word wizard and the school and the world he was being invited into. You're not here about the letter, he said. No. You're here about something bigger. The amber eyes caught the moonlight. Much bigger. Harry looked at the dragon, the ancient, enormous, careful creature sitting on the neighbor's roof at midnight with the studied composure of something that has been thinking about this conversation for 5 years, and made the same decision he'd been making his entire life, which was the decision not to be frightened of the thing in front of him when the thing in front of him was simply the truth. Tell me, he said. His name was Scareth, and he talked until 3 in the morning. Harry sat in the window frame, half in, half out, and listened with his entire attention. He was good at listening. He'd learned early that information was the most valuable resource available to someone in his position, because information told you how things actually worked as opposed to how you were told they worked, and those two maps were frequently very different. Scareth told him about the pulse, about what happened on his 6th birthday, the way the whole of dragonkind had felt it simultaneously, what it had meant. He told him about the summit in the Alps. About the declaration. He told him what the declaration meant in practice, and what it signified about the nature and age of the power Harry carried, and why it had responded to the dragons and not the other way around. He told him about Dumbledore. He was precise about it. Not angry, or rather, the anger was there, but old and cold, compressed under the weight of 5 years and a decision rather than a reaction. He laid out what was known and what was inferred and was careful about the difference, which Harry appreciated more than he would have been able to articulate. He put me here on purpose, Harry said when Scareth finished. Yes. The protection, the blood protection. He needed my mother's sister. That is what we understand. He could have told her what she was protecting. He could have watched. He could have checked. Yes. A pause. He could have done many things. Harry looked out at the street. The sprinkler, 2 houses down, was off at this hour. The street was very quiet. He thought about 11 years of this house and this street and this specific darkness, and he thought about the fact that somewhere, a man had done the arithmetic and decided it was worth it, and he thought about the warm thing in his chest and the amber eyes in his dream and the fact that the whole of dragonkind had been keeping watch over him, in their way, since he was 6 years old. What does the declaration mean for me, he said. Practically. What changes? You go to your school. You learn what you are. But you go knowing what we know, and you do not pretend otherwise to make anyone comfortable. And if Dumbledore tries to manage things, he will try to manage things. He is very good at it. The amber eyes held steady. You are better. Harry looked at the dragon for a long moment. You don't know that yet. I know what you carry. I have known it since you were 6 years old and you held it without breaking under conditions that would have unmade someone who didn't have it. Something moved in the amber eyes that wasn't quite emotion but functioned like it. That is not nothing, Harry Potter. It was the first time anyone had said his name like that. Not as a label or an address or a social marker. As a recognition. Harry sat in the window frame and felt the warm thing in his chest flare up briefly, and did not say anything for a moment, because the moment required being in rather than commenting on. Then, will I see you again? There is a forest near your school. A young dragon has been stationed there since September. Stationed, Harry said, with a slight emphasis that carried the question. The amber eyes caught something that might, in a human, have been described as dry amusement. She has a strong character and volunteered very insistently. Her name is Kazara. She will find you. A young one. Young is relative. She is 80 years old and has the temperament of something half that. Harry almost smiled. Right. Scarif looked at him for one more long moment, the kind of look that is also a taking stock, a final accounting, a reading of a thing that has been growing from a distance for 5 years. Whatever he found in it seemed to satisfy him. He drew back, slowly, that extraordinary head lifting from the level of the window, the long neck rising, the folded wings making a sound like a sail in wind as they shifted. Go to your school, he said, and his voice in the space behind Harry's eyes was quieter now, retreating with the physical distance. Learn what they offer. Take what is useful. Be not what they need you to be. Then the roof across the street was empty and the sky above Privet Drive was just a sky again, stars and the thin moon and the ordinary dark, and the only evidence that anything had been there was the deep rectangular depression in the neighbor's flat-roofed garage extension, which was going to cause the neighbor significant confusion in the morning and which Harry would always, privately, find very funny. He sat in the window for a while after, breathing the night air. Then he pulled himself back inside, lay down on his mattress, and looked at the ceiling in the dark. Be not what they need you to be. He thought about that for a long time. Across the country, in a stone office in a school that was currently empty of students for the summer, Albus Dumbledore sat at his desk and read a letter from Cornelius Fudge that he'd been putting off reading for 3 days. The letter was about the Dragon Declaration. Specifically, it was about the Ministry's formal communication from the Dragon Nations, which had arrived through official channels that morning and which contained, among other things, a request for the Ministry to open an inquiry into the living conditions and welfare of Harry James Potter, currently residing at No. 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Fudge's letter was, in its polite way, asking Dumbledore what he wanted done about this. Dumbledore set it down. He looked at the portrait behind his desk, the former headmaster Armando Dippet, who was asleep in his frame as usual. He looked at the array of silver instruments on his side table, each one monitoring a different set of conditions. The instruments were all reading normally. The blood wards at Privet Drive were stable. The boy was contained. Everything was proceeding. He picked up his quill and wrote back to Fudge. Cornelius, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. The Dragon Nations have strong feelings and sometimes those feelings exceed their information. I have monitored young Harry's welfare closely and can assure you he is safe and provided for. The conditions they reference are a matter of magical perception being misapplied to a Muggle domestic context. I recommend acknowledging their communication with a polite letter of assurance and allowing the matter to settle. These things have a way of resolving themselves if not inflamed by undue attention. He sealed it and sent it off with one of the school owls. Then he sat in the quiet office and listened to the summer air and the occasional sound of one of his instruments ticking softly on the table, and he thought about September, and Harry Potter arriving at Hogsmeade Station, and the careful architecture of the next 7 years. He was not a man given to doubt. He had made his decisions, he understood his reasons, and he had the kind of faith in his own judgment that comes from a lifetime of being the most capable person in every room. He had done what was necessary. The boy would come, and he would shape him, and the world would be saved in the only way the world could be saved, which was his way, the way he had been planning for a decade. The dragons were a complication, not a crisis. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it and went back to work. Minerva McGonagall heard about the Dragon Declaration from Phileas Flitwick, who told her in the staff room over tea with the careful, measured tone of someone sharing information they know will land badly. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was a feat for Minerva, who had opinions and generally felt that they should be aired in a timely fashion. When Flitwick finished, she was quiet for a moment. He put the address as the cupboard, she said. It wasn't a question. She had been the one who watched the house on Privet Drive for a day and a night before the boy was left there. She had noted the family. She had had misgivings that she had overridden because Dumbledore had told her to trust him, and she had trusted him, and 10 years later she was sitting in a staff room with a cooling cup of tea thinking about a boy whose Hogwarts letter had been addressed to the cupboard under the stairs. The Chinese Reserve's original communication was on file in the Ministry for 5 years, Flitwick said quietly. His voice, always precise, had a particular quality to it, the quality of someone choosing their words very carefully because the alternative is saying something they can't take back. It named him. By signature. By location. It was on file. Minerva set her teacup down. She looked at the staff room window. Outside the grounds were summer bright and empty, waiting for September. She thought about the boy who was going to come through those gates in 3 weeks, and she thought about what she knew and what she told herself she didn't know and what the difference between those two things actually was. Phileas, she said. When he arrives, yes, Flitwick said, which covered the rest of the sentence without her having to say it. They sat with it for a moment, the specific, heavy silence of two people who are not sure they behaved well and are beginning the process of deciding what to do about that. I'm going to watch, McGonagall said finally. Very carefully. Flitwick looked into his tea. So will others, he said. He won't be coming alone, you know. The declarations don't work the way ours do. They don't stay on paper. She knew what he meant. She nodded once, precisely, the way she did when she'd heard something that required a recalibration of expectations and had already begun the recalibration. Outside the staff room window, the summer afternoon lay across the grounds in long gold sheets, and somewhere in the forbidden forest, visible as a faint shimmer of heat if you knew exactly where to look, something dark-scaled and watchful shifted its wings and settled back into its chosen vantage point. Kazara had been here since September. She was patient, in the way that creatures twice the age of most wizarding careers were patient. She had found a section of the forest deep enough and adequately warded by its own history to conceal her bulk, and she had designated herself a particular flat rock on the forest's western edge from which, on clear days, she could see the school's towers. She watched the towers now. 3 weeks, she thought. The boy would come. She had heard Scaratha's account of the meeting on Privet Drive. She had heard what Scareth said about Harry Potter, not the myth, not the symbol, but what he'd actually found in the window of that cupboard. A child who had been alone so long that he'd built something out of the aloneness that most people spent their entire lives searching for. She was, she admitted to herself, intensely curious. She was also, though she would never have said this to Scareth, who would have found it undignified, looking forward to this in the way that she looked forward to very few things. She stretched one wing slightly, resettled it, and watched the school towers in the late afternoon light. 3 weeks. The night before Harry left for London, he stood in the smallest bedroom. He'd been moved back in permanently when the letter situation had escalated past what Uncle Vernon could manage through denial alone, and looked at the small collection of things that would constitute his packing. He didn't have much. The Hogwarts list required things he didn't own yet, robes, wand, books, cauldron, but the letter had come with information about Diagon Alley, and Dumbledore had arranged for a Hogwarts representative to escort him. He'd received a second letter, 2 days after the first, brief and warm and signed with a name he didn't recognize, Rubeus Hagrid, Keeper of Keys and Grounds. He'd also received something else, 3 days ago. A letter on no paper he recognized, heavy gray vellum, faintly warm to the touch, written in handwriting that had a vertical, angular quality unlike any human script he'd seen but was perfectly legible. It had said, in its entirety, the Hogwarts groundskeeper is a good person and can be trusted. The potions professor cannot. The headmaster will be charming. Do not mistake charm for honesty. He'd read it twice and smiled, which was not a thing he did often or easily, and put it in his pocket. He stood in the room and looked at the small pile of things he owned and thought about the fact that he was leaving this house in the morning and felt, cleanly and without complication, nothing. Not relief, exactly. Not excitement, exactly. Something more fundamental than either of those, the sensation of the thing that has been waiting finally beginning. He thought about Scaratha's voice in the space behind his eyes. Be not what they need you to be. He thought about the amber eyes on the neighbor's roof. He thought about Kazara in the forest, watching towers from a flat rock. He picked up the Hogwarts letter and folded it and put it in his pocket alongside the grey vellum one and went to bed, and slept without dreaming, which was the best kind of sleep and the rarest, and in the morning he was up before Aunt Petunia's alarm went off, dressed and ready at the door, and when Hagrid arrived, enormous, beaming, smelling of wood smoke and something that Harry thought might be dragon, which struck him as appropriate, Harry looked at him with the direct, unshielded attention of someone who has been told this person can be trusted and is verifying. Hagrid looked back at him, and whatever he saw in Harry's face made him pause for just a moment with his hand still raised from the knock. "You all right, Harry?" he said. "I'm fine," Harry said. "I'm ready." He stepped past the threshold of number 4, Privet Drive, and did not look back. In the smallest bedroom upstairs, the cupboard key hung on its hook by the kitchen door. The scratch marks Harry had made in the baseboard were still there, 31 of them leading to a birthday that had changed things in ways none of the Dursleys had ever been equipped to understand. The house settled around their absence. The sprinkler, 2 houses down, went on turning. Chapter 3, The Fire That Walks King's Cross was loud in the way that large public spaces are loud when you're carrying a secret, all the noise bouncing off you rather than including you, the world going about its business with cheerful indifference while you move through it with something burning quietly under your ribs. Harry pushed his trolley through the station and watched everything. That was a habit so old it had stopped feeling like a habit and started feeling like breathing, the constant low-level cataloging of a person who had learned early that the gap between noticing and not noticing was frequently the difference between a bad day and a worse one. He watched the board, and the crowds, and the platforms, and Hagrid moving ahead of him like a ship through water, people stepping aside without quite knowing why. He also watched for the platform. Hagrid had explained, in his enthusiastic and occasionally circular way, that platform 9 3/4 required walking through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, and that the trick was confidence, and not to stop, and not to worry about it. Harry had noted the advice and also noted that Hagrid had not actually demonstrated it, owing to Hagrid having a somewhat fraught relationship with the standard Muggle infrastructure. He found the barrier between the 2 platforms and stood in front of it for a moment. A family was loading luggage nearby, red-haired, loud, numerous, trailing owls and a cat in a carrier and what appeared to be an argument about something in a package that one of the smaller members had been explicitly told not to bring. The mother caught his eye. She had the face of someone who had been managing organized chaos for so long that she developed a kind of warm authority about it, the look of a person who loves difficult things because difficult things are interesting. "First time," she said. "Just walk straight at it, dear. Don't stop." Harry looked at the barrier. He thought about the warm thing in his chest, which had been building since Diagon Alley, since the wand choosing him in Ollivander's shop, since the first moment he'd set foot in Gringotts and felt the ancient magical weight of the place, since the moment in the robe shop when he tried on his Hogwarts robes and something in him had said yes, this is closer to right. He thought about Scaratha's voice and Kazara's letter and the 11 years of learning to trust his instincts absolutely. He walked at the barrier. The stone dissolved around him like smoke, and on the other side was a platform full of steam and voices and the smell of coal and magic, and a scarlet train that looked exactly like something between a dream and a very specific memory of a place he'd never been but recognized anyway. He stood on platform 9 3/4 and let it settle over him, and thought, here, then. This is where it starts. He found a compartment by himself and sat by the window and watched the platform through the glass. The red-haired family arrived shortly after him, all of them, which was a number he was still counting, and began the protracted business of farewells that large, demonstrative families conducted publicly and without apparent self-consciousness. The mother hugged each of them in turn. The twins, 2 boys who moved with the synchronized energy of people who have been finishing each other's thoughts since birth, said something to the smallest redhead that made him go pink and indignant. The girl, older, said something cutting that shut the twins up temporarily. The youngest boy, round-faced and looking slightly overwhelmed, said goodbye to his mother with the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to be visibly nervous and not entirely succeeding. Harry watched all of this without it being intrusive. He was good at watching things without being intrusive. It was the cupboard training, learning to be present without taking up space. The compartment door slid open and the nervous youngest redhead put his head in. "Sorry, everywhere else is full, is it alright if, go ahead," Harry said. The boy came in and sat down and they regarded each other for a moment with the frank mutual assessment of two 11-year-olds who have not yet learned to dress that up as anything other than what it is. "Ron," the boy said. "Ron Weasley." "Harry Potter," Harry said. Ron's eyebrows went up. His eyes flicked to Harry's forehead, registered the scar, and then, to his credit, Harry noted, made a visible effort not to make it the focus of the next several minutes. "Right," he said. "I've heard about you." "Most people have," Harry said. "Most of what they've heard isn't true." Ron considered this. "What part?" Harry thought about it. "The part where I'm going to tell you everything's fine," he said. "Everything isn't fine. But it will be, I think." Ron stared at him. Then, apparently deciding that this was an interesting response rather than an alarming one, he settled back in his seat with the manner of someone who has recalibrated and is prepared to continue. "My brothers say Hogwarts is brilliant," he said. "The twins say the first year is easy. I don't believe them because they've been lying to me about things being easy my entire life." "Probably wise," Harry said. Ron grinned. It was a good grin, uncomplicated, genuine, the kind that came from a person who hadn't yet learned to curate their expressions for public consumption. Harry found it unexpectedly easy to be around, in the way that straightforward things are easy after a long time spent with complicated ones. They talked through most of the journey. Not about the scar or Voldemort or the things that existed in the heavy mythology that Harry was already developing a clear picture of, the specific gravity that attached to his name in every wizarding person's voice, the way a room changed when someone realized who he was. Ron talked about Hogwarts and his family and Quidditch and the general state of life with 5 brothers, and Harry listened and occasionally contributed and gradually built up the picture he was always building, who this person was, what they were like under the social surface, whether the instinct that said this one is genuine was trustworthy. It was. He filed it away. A girl put her head in around Manchester, looking for a toad. She had a precise, slightly breathless quality about her, the manner of someone who is always 2 steps ahead in their head and occasionally forgets that the world runs at a different pace. Her name was Hermione Granger and she had already read all the textbooks, she said, with the faint pride of someone reporting a personal best. She looked at Harry with recognition, the scar, again, and then looked at him more carefully, in a way that suggested she was also performing her own assessment. "You know there are dragons in the Forbidden Forest," she said. It came out conversational, almost casual, but Harry caught the quality underneath it, testing, careful, watching his reaction. "I know," Harry said. She blinked. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down, across from Ron, with the air of someone who has found something worth staying for. "The groundskeeper, Hagrid, mentioned it to me in Diagon Alley. He seemed very unbothered by it. Almost proud." "Hagrid likes dragons," Ron said. "He'd keep one as a pet if he could." "He might get that chance," Harry said, mostly to himself. The train ran on through the middle of the country, the afternoon going gold out the window, and Harry looked at the landscape and thought about Khazara somewhere ahead, on a flat rock in a forest, watching towers, and felt the warm thing in his chest shift into something that was almost anticipation. The castle was lit against the evening sky when they first saw it from the boats, and Harry looked at it across the black lake and felt something that he didn't have language for yet but would later understand was the specific feeling of arriving somewhere you were always supposed to be, which is different from arriving somewhere you're wanted, and considerably more powerful. Hagrid's voice carried across the water, pointing things out, managing the boats with the casual ease of a person who has done this many times and still finds it genuinely wonderful. Harry watched the castle approach and thought about the letter, the cupboard under the stairs, and thought about the person who had written that address and what it said about what that person knew and had known. He filed it. He didn't push it. There would be time. The boats docked. They climbed stone steps. And then they were in the entrance hall, and Harry looked at the stone walls and the candles and the size of everything, built for something larger than human, or at least with the scale of something that had never learned to make itself fit into human-sized expectations, and he thought, yes. This, I understand. Professor McGonagall met them at the door. Harry had been told about McGonagall by Hagrid, who had described her as strict but fair, which was the kind of description that could mean many things. He watched her now, the straight spine, the precise gestures, the controlled face that had an expression somewhere between assessment and something more complicated that she was keeping carefully behind her eyes. She spoke to them about the sorting. She described the houses. Harry watched her watching him. She was doing exactly what he was doing, he realized. Reading. Trying to figure out what the year's Harry Potter was going to be, which version of the story was walking in through her door. Their eyes met briefly and he held her gaze for a moment without deference and without challenge, just a straight look, and something moved in McGonagall's expression, a small recalibration, quickly filed. Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't quite this. He looked away first, not because of discomfort but because there were other things to look at and the moment had been complete. The ghosts arrived and startled most of the first years and Harry watched with calm interest and thought that a ghost was, practically speaking, a person who had been so unwilling to let go that they'd managed a partial exemption from death, which seemed simultaneously admirable and very sad. A boy with a pointed face and pale eyes had appeared near Harry while they waited. He had the particular demeanor of someone who has grown up being told they're important and is now checking whether the world has received the information. He looked at Harry with a mixture of studied nonchalance and barely concealed urgency. "Draco Malfoy," he said, extending his hand with the manner of someone presenting credentials. Harry shook it, once, briefly. Harry Potter. Draco already knew this, obviously. Something moved in his eyes, excitement, and something else, a kind of social calculation. "My father mentioned you," he said. "He says you'll want to know the right sort of people before you end up with the wrong ones." His eyes tracked briefly to Ron with the specific contempt of someone who learned contempt young and has never examined it. "Your father doesn't know me," Harry said. "Not rude. Not aggressive. Just factual." Draco's eyes came back to him. The calculation shifted. "No, but, and neither do you yet," Harry said. "So I'd hold off on the advice." A pause. Draco looked at him the way people sometimes looked at things that hadn't behaved according to prediction, not angry, just reconfiguring. "Right," he said, eventually. Ron was looking at Harry with an expression of barely suppressed delight. They filed in. The great hall was exactly what it was, which was enormous, and old, and full of floating candles and the murmur of hundreds of students and 4 tables of houses arranged like the cardinal points of a compass, and at the staff table a row of faces that Harry began cataloguing before he was fully through the door. He found Dumbledore immediately. He would have found him even without the pointed hat and the silver beard and the centrality of his position. He would have found him because there was a quality to the man that occupied a room the way a stone occupies water, displacing everything around it, creating a shape in the space that everything else oriented to. He was looking at the first years with an expression of warm, benevolent pleasure, and his eyes moved across the line of them with the practiced ease of a man doing several things at once, cataloging, assessing, performing welcome for the room. His eyes found Harry. Harry held the look. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He just looked, direct and level, the same way he'd looked at McGonagall. Dumbledore's expression didn't change on the surface. But something very subtle shifted behind his eyes, a slight increase in attention, a recalibration, quick and contained. He was good. Harry could tell he was very good. He wasn't as good as he thought he was. Harry looked away and checked the rest of the staff table. A man with a turban who didn't appear quite comfortable in his own skin, the discomfort was too pervasive to be physical, sat too deep. A man with greasy hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a cold, assessing expression, who was already looking at Harry with something that was not warmth. A small man with a wide smile who would turn out to be Flitwick, though Harry didn't know that yet, and who was also watching with an attention that had a different quality from the others, careful, precise, and without agenda. The Sorting Hat sang. Harry listened to the song with actual attention, which apparently made him unusual among the first years, most of whom were nervously rehearsing their own names. The song was interesting. It knew more than it let on. That was the impression he took from it, something very old, full of more than it was showing, making a performance of simplicity. He filed that too. The sorting went in alphabetical order, which put Harry near the end. He stood and watched name after name called forward and hat placed and houses announced, and the hall responding to each one with the particular collective noise of hundreds of people performing enthusiasm. He watched Draco get sorted into Slytherin with a speed that said the hat hadn't needed long. He watched Hermione get sorted into Gryffindor after a brief pause that suggested the hat had considered options. He watched Ron fidget in front of him and settle his shoulders and go forward when called, Gryffindor also, quick. Then, Potter, Harry. The hall went very quiet. He walked to the stool and sat down with the same contained economy of movement he used for everything, and the hat came down over his head and everything went dark. The hat's voice arrived inside his skull with the quality of something that had been doing this for a very long time and had achieved a kind of grand, settled perspective about it. Well, it said. This is different. Harry waited. Most children come to me with a question. You've come with the answers already. Interesting. I have some of them, Harry thought back. More than most adults in this room. A pause that felt like thoughtful turning over of pages. You could go anywhere, you know. Genuinely anywhere. I haven't had one like this in, well, a long time. The power is extraordinary, but power is simple. It's the shape of the mind I'm sorting, and yours is, another pause. Fierce. Loyal in the specific way. Honest in a way that will make some people very uncomfortable. And brave, but not the performative kind. The kind that comes from having been frightened for a long time and deciding not to be anymore. Where do I go? Harry thought. Where do you want to go? Harry thought about it honestly. He thought about red and gold and the feeling in the song. He thought about what he knew and what he was carrying and what was waiting in the forest on a flat rock. He thought about Ron's uncomplicated grin and Hermione's careful, measuring eyes and what it would mean to be in the same house as people who were going to matter. Gryffindor, he thought. Yes, the hat said, with something that felt almost like relief, or perhaps gratitude, I rather thought so. Gryffindor, it shouted, and the table on the left side of the hall came apart into noise. Harry took the hat off and handed it back to McGonagall, who was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, and walked to the Gryffindor table. He sat down across from Ron and next to a spot that Hermione was working her way toward from the other end, and the feast appeared with a great wave of noise and food and the specific social chaos of a new school year's first meal. He picked up his fork and looked down the table and looked up at the staff table and found that Dumbledore was looking at him with warm approval and a slight tilt of the head that managed to convey, without words, well done, welcome, I'm pleased. Harry looked at him for a moment and then looked away and started eating. He went to the window of his dormitory that night after the others were asleep. The dormitory was in a tower, which meant the window looked out over the grounds, the dark sweep of the lawns, the glittering black of the lake, and at the southern edge of everything, the wall of the forbidden forest, shadow-dense and motionless under the stars. He looked at the forest for a long time. Nothing moved. Nothing visible. But the warm thing in his chest had shifted in the way it shifted when something was close rather than far, and after a minute he saw it, not the dragon herself, but the absence of stars in one specific place, a darkness too absolute and too still to be shadow. Kazara, on her flat rock at the forest's edge, looking at the tower. He raised one hand. The darkness didn't move. Then, slowly, something at the edge of the forest's shadow extended and retracted, a wing, he realized, one enormous wing unfolded a precise inch and then refolded. A gesture. A confirmation. "I'm here," it said without saying anything. Harry put his hand down. He looked at the forest for another minute and then at the castle around him, the stone and the old magic and the sleeping boys in their beds and the vast, complicated institution he'd just entered, and thought about everything that was in motion. The Declaration. Dumbledore. The Philosopher's Stone, which Hagrid had mentioned in passing in Diagon Alley in the way Hagrid mentioned things in passing that were considerably less casual than they sounded. The turban-wearing professor with the uncomfortable in-his-own-skin quality. He thought about Scaratha's voice, "Take what is useful. Be not what they need you to be." He went to bed. The next 3 weeks had a quality he hadn't been prepared for, which was that he was genuinely interested in things. He hadn't expected this. He had been braced for the experience of school, a new version of the performance he'd run at his Muggle primary school, managing expectations and keeping the profile low and learning what he needed and not attracting the wrong kind of attention. He had been braced for tedium. What he got instead was flying lessons that made his whole body feel like it had finally understood its purpose, and transfiguration that was like learning to argue with the fundamental assumptions of matter, and charms that was, in Flitwick's hands especially, something entirely alive. He was good at things. Not in the labored, practiced way of someone working hard to achieve, but in the immediate, instinctive way of someone for whom it comes naturally, and he was honest enough with himself to note this without either false modesty or arrogance. He was good at this. These things fit the shape of his mind. Flitwick noticed. Harry noticed Flitwick noticing, and one afternoon after class, when the other students had filed out, Flitwick looked at him over his stack of papers with bright, dark eyes and said, "You handle wand work differently than everyone else, Mr. Potter. Have you studied before Hogwarts?" "No," Harry said. "I didn't know I was a wizard until the summer." Flitwick looked at him carefully. "And yet the wand work is intuitive. Almost as if you're not directing the spell so much as suggesting it." "That's what it feels like," Harry said honestly. "Like the magic already knows what I want. I'm just confirming it." Something moved in Flitwick's expression, deep and complicated, and quickly composed. He nodded once, precisely. "I see," he said, in the tone of someone who sees considerably more than the sentence covers. "Come to me if you have questions about anything. My door is open to you." Harry nodded. He liked Flitwick. The man was honest with his attention in a way most people weren't. He had been at Hogwarts for 2.5 weeks when he went into the forest for the first time. It wasn't planned, exactly. He'd been out at the edge of the grounds in the early morning. He was always up before the rest of the dormitory, an 11-year life of necessity having calibrated his body to early waking with no negotiation, walking the eastern perimeter the way he walked perimeters, mapping things. He had reached the point where the grounds gave way to the forest and he had stood there in the grey morning air looking at the trees, and the warm thing in his chest had gone from background noise to something urgent and directional. He stepped into the forest. It was different inside immediately. The quality of the air changed, the light going from clear grey to something filtered and older, the sound of the grounds dropping away behind him. He walked for about 10 minutes on a path that wasn't a path exactly but functioned as one, gaps between trees that were consistently wide enough for something large to have moved through them repeatedly. He came into a small natural clearing and stopped. Kazara was lying along a flat rock at the clearing's far edge with her head up and her eyes already on him, and he stood there for a moment just registering, magnificent. Not in the way that word usually worked, with its suggestions of distant grandeur. Close up, she was magnificent the way a fire is magnificent, specific and present and dangerously alive. Her scales were a deep blue-black that caught the filtered morning light in purples and greens at the edges. Her eyes were amber, like Scaratha's, but where Scaratha's amber was old and settled, hers was brighter, vivid and alert and currently doing a rapid, comprehensive inventory of him. "You're smaller than I expected," she said. Her voice in his chest landed differently from Scaratha's, quicker, sharper, with a dry edge to it. "You're larger than I expected," he said, which was technically true. She was about the size of a bus, which was at the smaller end for dragons but was still a bus. Her eyes narrowed fractionally. Then something moved in them that was definitely amusement. "Scarith said you were not easy to startle. I've been expecting you for weeks. I know. I watched you notice me at the window your first night." She shifted slightly on the rock, a small repositioning of enormous weight that shook the clearing's floor in a way Harry felt in his feet. "You raised your hand. You raised your wing." "I did." She looked at him for a moment. "You know what you are?" "Mostly," Harry said. "I know what Scarith told me and I know what I've been reading and I know what I feel. I don't know all the names for it yet. The names aren't important. The names are for other people." She tilted her head, a movement that in a smaller creature would have read as birdlike, in her read as the reorientation of something geological. "How is the school?" "Interesting. Flitwick is good. Quirrell isn't right." Kazara's eyes sharpened. "What do you mean, not right?" "He's uncomfortable in a way that goes all the way down. Like he's wearing himself rather than being himself. And he smells." Harry paused, because saying he smells wrong required either committing to a level of instinctive assessment or hedging it, and he'd made a decision about hedging. "Wrong. There's something underneath him. Something that doesn't fit." Kazara was very still. "There is a thing in this castle that should not be here," she said slowly. "Scarith knows of it. Something connected to the one who," she stopped. "Who killed my parents," Harry said. "Voldemort." She didn't flinch at the name, which he noted with approval. "The remnant of him has found a host," she said. "The Turban Professor." Harry nodded. He'd figured this much. "And there's something he wants. In the castle. We know. The stone." He thought about the third-floor corridor, the locked door, Quirrell's gaze sliding toward it in the corridor sometimes, the specific quality of want that attached to a person who is oriented toward something. He thought about Fluffy. He'd heard about Fluffy from Hagrid, who really did not have the instinct for confidentiality, and what was presumably beneath the trapdoor. "He'll make a move before the end of year," Harry said. "Yes." Kazara looked at him steadily. "Are you going to let the adults handle it?" Harry thought about Dumbledore, who had arranged his childhood with the serene confidence of a man playing chess. He thought about the stone sitting in a school full of children, protected by obstacles that Quirrell was presumably working through methodically. "No," he said. Kazara's eyes held something that was not quite satisfaction but was in that neighborhood. "Good," she said. "I'll need to know more about the stone," Harry said. "And about what's beneath the trapdoor. And I'll need to know what Voldemort, the remnant of him, is actually capable of in that state. What he can and can't do." "I can find out the latter," she said. "There are resources available to the dragon nations that don't answer to Dumbledore." "Is Scarith monitoring the situation?" "Scarith is monitoring everything." She said this with the affectionate exasperation of someone describing a personality trait that is simultaneously admirable and relentless. "He is also coordinating with the Goblin Liaison, who has been tracking the financial instruments connected to the stone's original vault. And with a third party that I will tell you about when you're ready." "Tell me now," Harry said. She looked at him for a moment with those vivid amber eyes. "Then, there is a man in Azkaban who should not be there. He was put there by the same machinery that put you in your cupboard, convenient, fast, no trial. His name is Sirius Black. He is your godfather." Harry went very still. The word godfather landed somewhere new and deep, in a part of him that hadn't expected to be reached. He'd known he had parents who were dead. He'd known he'd been delivered to the Dursleys. He had not known there was someone who was specifically supposed to have been his who had been prevented from being. He kept his face even. He'd had 11 years of practice keeping his face even. He's in Azkaban for something he didn't do, Harry said. Yes. Dumbledore knows. We believe so. We cannot prove it yet. Her voice was careful. The goblins are working on the trial records. Or rather, the absence of trial records. Harry breathed out slowly through his nose. The morning light in the clearing had grown, the grey going to pale gold through the leaves. He looked at Kazara on her rock and thought about the man in Azkaban and thought about the way power worked, not the magical kind, but the institutional kind, the kind that has been in place long enough that people stop questioning it, that dresses itself as order and calls its choices necessity. Get him out, Harry said. Kazara tilted her head. It's not simple. I know it's not simple. Work on it. He met her eyes. He's my family. He's the only one I have. Work on it. A long pause. Something moved in her expression, something that was very close to the feeling that Scaratha's voice had carried when he said Harry's name on the roof at Privet Drive. The quality of being seen and found to be more than expected. Yes, she said simply. They stayed in the clearing a few minutes more, talking logistics, how Harry would communicate with her, a system using the marks on the third window ledge of his dormitory that would serve as a simple code. She told him about the Dragon Nation's presence in the wider political landscape, what the Declaration had done to the relations between the Ministry and the magical creatures' communities, how Dumbledore had managed to soften most of the political fallout through the combination of charm and carefully placed reassurances. He's not going to find it as easy going forward, Harry said. No, Kazara agreed. Because going forward you are here and visible and he can no longer manage the situation remotely. She paused. He will try to be your guide. Your protector. He will be warm and wise and interested in you. He will give you small freedoms to make you feel trusted and use them as string to wind around you. I know, Harry said. You sound very certain. I've been managed before, he said. 11 years of people who thought I couldn't see what they were doing while they were doing it. He's better at it than the Dursleys. That's the only difference. Kazara looked at him steadily. And you will let him think it's working. For a while, Harry said. Long enough. She made a sound, low and resonant, felt rather than heard, that Harry would come to recognize as her version of approval. He filed it. He left the clearing and walked back through the forest toward the castle with the morning light broadening around him, and when he emerged from the tree-lean Hagrid was standing at his hut's door with a mug of something large in his hand, and looked at Harry coming out of the forest with wide eyes. Harry, he said, with the expression of someone who wanted to say several things and was deciding which one first. You shouldn't, the forest isn't, I know, Harry said. I was careful. There are things in there, I know about those too, Harry said, which was true, because Kazara had shown him on a rough mental map where the Acromantulas were and where the Centaurs were and where the things that were genuinely dangerous had their territories and how to avoid them. Hagrid stared at him. His enormous hand wrapped around his mug, and for a moment his big, weather-scarred face had an expression that was very hard to read, not quite alarm, not quite admiration, something between the two. You're a funny kid, he said finally, with affection. I mean that in the best way. I know you do, Harry said, and meant it. He went inside for breakfast. He saw Dumbledore properly for the first time, alone, without the buffer of a hall full of students, on a Tuesday afternoon when he was coming out of the library and turned a corner and nearly walked into him. Dumbledore caught his shoulder to steady him, reflexively, and they stood in the corridor with the particular social intimacy of two people who have collided and are now closer than intended. Harry, Dumbledore said, and the warmth in it was extraordinary, not performed, Harry noted, or rather performed so well that the performance had become natural, which was its own kind of remarkable. I'm glad to have run into you. Literally, as it turns out. Headmaster, Harry said. I've been hoping we might speak. I try to make time for all my first years in the early weeks, but, a pause, a slight smile that managed to convey warmth and self-deprecation and honest admission of having delayed. I confess I've been cowardly. I wasn't sure what kind of meeting to expect. Harry looked at him. What kind were you expecting? Someone angry, I thought, Dumbledore said, and the directness of it was calibrated perfectly, the kind of honesty that builds trust by appearing to cost something. You have reasons, I imagine, to have feelings about your childhood that may be directed toward me. You imagine correctly, Harry said. A brief pause. Something moved in Dumbledore's eyes, respect, Harry thought, or the performance of respect, and he was genuinely unsure which it was, which he noted as interesting. The man was very good. I want you to know, Dumbledore said carefully, that the decisions I made were made with the information I had and with the intention of your safety. Not your comfort, I regret that, but your survival. My survival, Harry said. He let the word sit there for a moment. Was it necessary for my survival that no one checked on me? That no one responded to the dragon's communication 5 years ago? That my Hogwarts letter was addressed to the cupboard and no one considered that worth looking into? The corridor was quiet. In a classroom nearby someone was doing charms practice, the repeated light thud of a spell finding its target. Dumbledore looked at Harry and his expression was very still, and Harry could feel the recalibration happening, the rapid internal assessment of what this child knew and how he knew it and what the optimal response was. You know about the Dragon Declaration, Dumbledore said. I know about a lot of things, Harry said. I've had help. He kept his voice even and his face neutral and his eyes steady on Dumbledore's. I'm not angry at you right now, Headmaster. I want you to know that because I want you to know I mean it when I say I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I know. I'm not going to be managed. I'm not going to be positioned. I'm going to learn what this school offers and I'm going to be honest about what I see and I'm going to do what's necessary when it's necessary. A very long pause. Dumbledore looked at him. And for the first time, just briefly, in a flicker that was gone almost before Harry registered it, the warm grandfather expression dropped, and underneath it was something more complicated and more honest, a man looking at something that had not proceeded according to plan and doing the rapid, brilliant arithmetic of what that meant for everything that came after. Then the warmth came back. Gentler. Slightly different in quality, recalibrated. You are remarkable, Dumbledore said quietly. I'm honest, Harry said. It reads as remarkable when the people around you are used to not being told the truth. He said it without heat, just factual. I'll be in your office when you want to speak again. Genuinely speak. He stepped past Dumbledore and continued down the corridor. Behind him, he felt the headmaster's gaze for the full length of the hallway. He did not look back. He turned the corner and exhaled once, quietly, and felt the warm thing in his chest running fast and hot. More actions. Right, the next chapter now. Chapter 4, Scales and Secrets. October arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, sideways, in the form of wind off the lake that found every gap in the castle's stonework and the specific grey light that turned the grounds from green to something more honest about what the season was. Harry noticed October because October changed the rhythm of things. The novelty of September had worn off the other first years and what replaced it was the dawning realization that the work was real and accumulating and that Hogwarts, whatever else it was genuinely demanding. The common room filled up with people staring at parchment with expressions ranging from determined to quietly panicked. Hermione moved through this like a ship through fog, unbothered, organized, occasionally stopping to help someone who asked and once or twice helping someone who hadn't but clearly needed it. Ron was working harder than he let on. Harry noticed this because Harry noticed most things, and because Ron had a tell, he chewed his quill when he was thinking and denied doing it when anyone pointed it out, which was charming in the way that unself-conscious habits are charming. Harry was moving through the curriculum the way he moved through most things, efficiently, without drama, going considerably further than the assigned work because the assigned work kept stopping at the point where things got interesting. He'd finished the first-year charms syllabus in the third week of October and was working through the second-year material with Flitwick's quiet encouragement, which manifested as carefully suggested reading and the occasional pointed question that pushed Harry into territory he hadn't explored yet. Flitwick never made it a performance. He just left doors open and watched, with those bright dark eyes, to see which ones Harry walked through. Harry walked through all of them. Transfiguration was McGonagall's domain, and she ran it with the precision of someone who has very high standards and takes it as a personal failing when those standards aren't met. Harry's first Transfiguration class had established something between them, not warmth exactly, not yet, but the specific mutual respect of two people who recognize in each other a complete absence of interest in performance. McGonagall taught him the same way she taught everyone, rigorously, without softening the difficult parts. But she watched him the same way Flitwick watched him, with that added layer of attention that had something personal in it, something that looked occasionally like it was fighting with itself. He didn't push it. Things like that required time. Potions was different. Snape had looked at Harry on the first day with an expression that Harry had catalogued as old grievance, personal, pre-existing, directed at him for reasons that had nothing to do with him specifically and everything to do with someone he'd never met. He'd been prepared for this by Kazara's letter, which had said the potions professor cannot be trusted without elaborating. He'd done his own reading since then, careful, lateral reading that used the library's older holdings and some intuitive gap-filling, and had developed a working theory. The theory was that Snape had loved his mother and hated his father, and Harry was an uncomfortable combination of both, which was not Harry's problem but was apparently going to be made into one. In the first class Snape had fired questions at him with the manner of someone hoping to find an empty vessel, and Harry had answered everything correctly and without the apologetic hedging that might have softened the blow to Snape's apparent preference for him to be ignorant. This had produced a silence that was different from approval, a recalibration of the attack rather than an abandonment of it. Since then Snape had found subtler methods. Deducting points for things that were not actually errors. The particular quality of silence he maintained while watching Harry work that was designed to unsettle. Harry did not allow himself to be unsettled. He worked with the same clean precision in potions that he worked with in everything else, and when Snape found something to criticize he fixed it without argument and without the emotional response that the criticism had been designed to produce. He was not interested in Snape's history with his parents. That was Snape's to manage. What he was interested in, and this he paid close attention to, was what Snape knew. Because Snape knew an extraordinary amount, and his brain, under the grievance and the performance of coldness, was precise and deep and connected things in ways that were genuinely worth paying attention to. So Harry paid attention, and took what was useful, and continued doing exactly what he told Dumbledore he was going to do. The stone was the thing he kept coming back to. He'd been turning it over since September, approaching it from different angles the way you approach a problem that has several layers and you're not sure which layer is the real one. What he knew, the stone had been moved from Gringotts, Vault 713, which Hagrid had emptied on Dumbledore's instructions the day Harry had been in Diagon Alley, and brought to Hogwarts, where it was protected by a set of enchantments in the third-floor corridor. What he understood, Quirrell, with Voldemort's remnant riding the back of his skull, was working toward it methodically. What bothered him was not the threat itself but the architecture of it. Dumbledore had put the stone in a school. He had put it under protections that were, when Harry mapped them out in his head, and he had been carefully mapping them, using what Kazara had relayed from sources that had access to the castle's older architectural records, combined with his own observations, designed to be passable by a student. Not easily passable. Not carelessly passable. But passable, deliberately, by someone with the right combination of skills and knowledge. The protections were a gauntlet, and the gauntlet was the kind that required working through it, and the person who had designed it had apparently not considered the possibility that the trap setter might be the most dangerous person approaching the stone. He sat with this in the library on a grey Thursday afternoon and thought about what it meant that Dumbledore had set up a situation in which Harry was likely to end up confronting it, which required Harry to be in danger, which, considering the blood protections and the prophecy and everything else that Harry had pieced together, seemed to be a feature rather than a flaw in the design. Hermione sat down across from him with a stack of books that suggested she was working on her charms essay and needed 3 times the sources assigned. "You're doing that thing," she said without looking up from opening the top book. What thing? Where you stare at nothing and everyone gives you a wide berth because it looks like you're solving something uncomfortable. She flipped to a page with the efficient page-turning of someone who reads fast and knows exactly what she's looking for. You've been doing it more than usual the last week. Harry looked at her. He'd been doing his own assessment of Hermione Granger for the past 2 months and had reached conclusions that he trusted. She was brilliant, honest in the specific way that includes being honest about things that are uncomfortable, loyal in a way that hadn't been tested yet but read as fundamental, and possessed of a moral seriousness that occasionally outran her emotional instincts but was genuinely her own and not performed. He trusted her. That wasn't a decision he reached often or lightly. Quirrell, he said. Her eyes came up from the book immediately. Something moved in her expression, recognition, and relief, and the specific expression of someone who has been thinking the same thing and wasn't sure how to raise it. I've been watching him, she said quietly. He's not right. He hasn't been right since September. The stutter is inconsistent, she said. It disappears sometimes mid-sentence and then comes back. And I don't know how to describe it, the presence of him. It's like talking to a costume. There's something on the back of his head under the turban, Harry said. She stared at him. How do you know that? I'm good at knowing things, he said, which was not the full answer but was accurate. He wasn't ready to explain Khazara or the Dragon Network to Hermione yet. That conversation required more privacy and time than the Hogwarts library offered. What I want to know is the timeline. He's been working through the protections. I think he's close. Hermione was quiet for a moment, turning this over. We should tell McGonagall. We could, Harry said. She'd pass it to Dumbledore, who already knows and has built the whole thing as a trap. Hermione's mouth pressed together, the expression she got when she'd received information that conflicted with her framework and was processing the conflict. You think Dumbledore wants Quirrell to get through? I think Dumbledore wants me to stop him, Harry said. And I think those two things are not the same as Dumbledore actually doing anything about the stone himself. A long pause. If you're right, yes, Harry said. She looked at the table surface for a moment. What are you going to do? Go through first, he said. When I'm ready. Before Quirrell makes his move. Her eyes came back up. They were clear and direct and doing the rapid calculation that her eyes always did when she was working out whether to argue or assist. I'm coming with you, she said. Harry looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Her voice had a quiet edge of impatience in it. I'm going to anyway. I've been working through the logic of the protections since October. I've figured out most of them. You're going to need the logic ones. The potion's riddle at the end is almost certainly logic-based. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once. Ron too, he said. She blinked. He can play chess. He's good at it, Harry said. I think we'll need it. She turned back to her book, but there was a different quality to her attention now, not distracted, more focused, the kind of focus that comes from having a plan. Tell me when you want to move, she said. Soon, Harry said. Before the end of term. He was at the lakeside when the letter arrived. He'd taken to coming to the lake in the early mornings when the mist was still sitting on the water and the grounds were empty. It was a good thinking space, open and cold and honest, without the weight of the castle's accumulated history pressing from all directions. He'd been out there for 20 minutes with his hands in his pockets and the grey lake doing its slow, lightning thing when the owl came in low and fast from the north, a small tawny that landed on the flat stone beside him and stuck its leg out with the impatience of something that had been flying for a while. The note was short, written in handwriting he didn't recognize, on paper that was neither parchment nor any Muggle equivalent. We have the records. No trial. Evidence planted by a Death Eater named Peter Pettigrew, who is alive. This will take more time to make public in a way that cannot be suppressed. Tell your forest contact, she should know the third name. Harry read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it inside his robes. Peter Pettigrew. He turned the name over. Alive. Which meant that Sirius had been imprisoned for something that could be disproved by the continued existence of the man who'd actually done it, and whoever had managed it with speed and without a trial, which required either complete institutional failure or deliberate institutional complicity, and neither option was accidental. He stood at the lake and let the cold November air move over him and thought about Sirius Black, the name, the idea, the specific weight of your godfather, and felt something he rarely let himself feel, which was anger. Not the hot, reactive kind. The cold, certain, load-bearing kind that sits in the chest like ballast and makes you very steady. He went to the forest before breakfast. Kazara was in the clearing, already awake, her scales picking up what pale light filtered through the canopy. She looked at him when he came in and read whatever was in his face and said, "News." "Pettigrew," he said. "He's the third name." Her eyes narrowed. Then went wide, which on a dragon's face was a significant expression, the amber irises expanding, the pupils thinning to a sharp vertical line. "Pettigrew," she repeated, very slowly. "He's alive. The goblins have the records." "Where is he?" "I don't know yet." Harry looked at her steadily. "But I need Sirius out before the end of the year. I need it moving." "The legal route takes time, then use another route," Harry said. "I'm not asking you to break him out. I'm asking you to accelerate whatever the goblins are building toward and not let it get buried." He paused. "Dumbledore has influence over the Wisengamot. If the petition reaches them through normal channels it will land on Dumbledore's desk and stay there." Kazara looked at him for a long, measuring moment. "You want it to reach the Wisengamot through a channel he can't intercept. The Dragon Nations have standing before the International Confederation," Harry said. "Not the Wisengamot, but the ICW. And the ICW has authority over miscarriage of justice cases that extend to—" "Yes," Kazara said. She had that quality again, the vivid attention, the alertness, the speed of something that processes quickly. "I know the authority. I know the path." A pause. "You've been researching this." "Since you told me about him," Harry said. "I've had weeks." She looked at him with those amber eyes and the expression that was closest to what he'd call admiration, though she would likely have chosen a different word. "I'll contact Scarith today," she said. "The ICW filing requires signatures from 3 Dragon Nation representatives. I know where to find them." "How long?" "Weeks. Not months." She held his gaze. "We will get him out, Harry." He nodded. The anger in his chest was still there but balanced now, oriented rather than just burning. He turned it into the next thing. "The stone," he said. "Tell me." He walked her through what he'd mapped, the corridor, the protections, his analysis of the timeline. She listened without interrupting, which with Kazara meant she was engaged completely. When he finished she was quiet for a moment. "The thing inside Quirrell is diminished," she said. "A remnant only. It cannot perform magic independently. It is dependent on Quirrell's body and Quirrell's skill, which is adequate but not exceptional." "What happens if it gets the stone?" Harry said. "It regains a body. A real one, not a host." She paused. "Not immediately. The stone makes the elixir. The elixir takes time. But the process begins. So the stone can't be allowed to reach him." "No. And if I face him, the remnant, in the chamber," Harry said. "What am I actually facing?" Kazara considered for a moment with the care of something choosing precision over speed. "You are facing a soul fragment that has been living as a parasite for over a year. It is cunning and it is afraid, and afraid things are dangerous in specific ways, they are unpredictable and they do not stop. But it is not Voldemort." She met his eyes. "It is not what killed your parents. That thing is gone. This is a splinter of it, desperate and diminished. Can I destroy it?" A pause. "The old fire you carry," she said carefully. Scareth believes, and the other elders concur, that what you carry is fundamentally incompatible with what Voldemort is. What he made himself into. He unmade something essential in himself to become what he became, and what you carry is the opposite of that unmaking. Harry thought about this. He thought about the wand in Ollivander's shop, the way it had felt when he picked it up, the warm rush of recognition, the way Ollivander had gone very still and said curious in a voice that meant something specific. He thought about the way magic felt when he did it, not effortful, not mechanical, but the sensation of something very large moving in response to something very small, like a key in a well-made lock. "I'll be ready," he said. He almost wasn't. Not because of the confrontation, that came later, but because of what happened on Halloween, which disrupted everything with the particular chaos of events that arrive without warning and rearrange your timetable completely. The troll came in through the dungeons. Harry was in the great hall when Quirrell came running in with his turban at a distorted angle and his eyes wide with an expression that Harry clocked immediately as performance, the specific quality of a face doing what it's supposed to do rather than responding to what it's feeling, that tells not in the broad strokes of fear but in the micro-expressions underneath them, the satisfaction that kept surfacing between the shock. He watched Quirrell faint with mild interest and began planning as the hall dissolved into noise. He found Hermione by pure process of elimination, the only person definitely not in the hall. He found Ron in the process of finding Hermione, which was coincidence but not surprising. Ron had the instinct of someone who orients toward people he considers his, whether he's consciously named the feeling yet or not. The troll was large and stupid and moving the way large stupid things move in enclosed spaces, all force and no direction. Harry walked into the bathroom with Ron and Hermione and the troll swung its club and shook the ceiling and Hermione pressed herself against the wall between two sinks and Harry stood in the middle of the room and looked at the troll. It swung at him. He stepped sideways, no wand, just the step, clean and precise, the gap between the club and his shoulder a matter of inches, and looked at the troll looking at him, and said, clearly and without urgency, Immobulus. The spell hit the troll like a wall of solid air. It didn't freeze exactly, it staggered, its momentum arrested, and looked at Harry with small stupid eyes that had a new quality in them that was almost alarm. Harry hit it again. Stupefy. The troll dropped. Ron stared at the troll on the floor. Then at Harry. You're not supposed to know that spell until third year. I read ahead, Harry said. Hermione, who had been holding her breath against the sink, exhaled and straightened. She looked at Harry in the way she sometimes looked at him, the straight, clear look that processed things quickly and honestly. That was wandless, she said. Partly, Harry said. He had his wand in his hand, he'd drawn it when he came through the door, just not used it for the first spell. He looked at it. I don't always need it. Does that happen often? She said. Getting more frequent, he said honestly. She filed it, the way she filed things, quick and efficient and without making it larger than it was. He appreciated that about her. The teachers arrived and the explanations happened and Gryffindor got awarded points that Harry thought were primarily political, and the night resolved itself. But something had shifted. The two of them, Ron and Hermione both, had been present for something real, and the recalibration was visible in the way they looked at him after. Not differently, exactly. Not with the distance that the Harry Potter mythology sometimes produced in people who realized suddenly that the mythology was sitting next to them in class. The recalibration was the opposite direction, closer, more specific, the look of people who have been next to something in a crisis and came through it and understand each other better for it. He found he was glad of that. November ran into December and the castle took on the particular quality it got when Christmas was approaching, cold corridors and candle-heavy common rooms and the sense of a term winding toward its close. Harry was watching Quirrell more carefully now and what he saw was a deterioration, subtle, progressive, the quality you see in someone who is maintaining something at considerable personal cost. The turban sat differently. Quirrell's hands shook sometimes. He made small errors in his teaching that he covered quickly but that Harry caught each time. Whatever was living on the back of his head was taking more than Quirrell had left to give. It was also, Harry assessed, getting impatient. He began his own preparation with the methodical thoroughness of someone who does not go into difficult situations without understanding every variable he has access to. He pushed his wandless work to its edge, the spells that required precision rather than power, the ones that were about intent more than mechanism. He worked on shields. He worked on the particular kind of controlled focus that had been the thing under his magic since the beginning and that felt, when he pushed it, like it could do considerably more than produce a charm's result. He also worked on something else. He'd been reading, deep reading, the kind that required the restricted section, which required a signed permission that Professor Flitwick had provided without questions when Harry had asked, in the straightforward way he asked things, for access to research he was doing on old magic. He'd found what he was looking for in a book that had no listed author and smelled of something ancient and mineral and that had, in its middle section, a chapter titled simply, On the Nature of What Cannot Be Unmade. He read it twice in one sitting and sat with it for a long time afterward in the empty library, the cold December light coming through the high windows, and thought about Voldemort's soul fragment and the old fire in his chest and what the chapter was describing, which was a type of magical encounter that the book called a counter-resonance, the meeting of a thing that has unmade itself with a thing that is fundamentally whole, and what happened when those two things made direct contact. He thought about his mother's sacrifice. He thought about what it had taken to perform it and what kind of magic it produced and what it meant that the product of it was still alive in his blood and in his scar and in the specific warmth he felt when the dragon's old fire moved through him. He thought about what would happen in the chamber under the third-floor corridor. He felt, with the clean certainty of something that has been building all term and has now reached its final form, that he was ready. He told Ron and Hermione on a Sunday 2 weeks before end of term, in the corner of the common room after most people had gone to bed. He told them what he knew, the stone, Quirrell, the chamber. He told them what he was planning. He did not tell them about Khazara or the full extent of the Dragon Network because that conversation required more than a Sunday night, but he told them enough. Ron listened with his chess player's attention, not just hearing the surface of it but working through the implications, his eyes going somewhere else briefly and then coming back. The protections, he said. The ones in the corridor. There's a chess game. McGonagall's, Harry said. It's wizard chess. Life-sized. Ron nodded slowly. He didn't say I can do that because he didn't need to. They both already knew it. I won't be able to come through with you to the end, he said. The game will require a sacrifice. The pieces will need someone to stay. Yes, Harry said. I know. I'll be the one, Ron said, without drama. Just factual, the way he stated things when he meant them completely. You and Hermione go through. Hermione looked at Ron and then at Harry and the expression on her face was the specific expression of someone who respects a decision being made but hasn't stopped being worried about it. The logic puzzle at the end, Harry said to her. You'll get it. I know I will, she said, equally factual. After I get through, you go on alone. Yes. And you face him. Yes. A brief silence. The common room fire crackled. Somewhere in the castle a door closed distantly. Are you afraid? Hermione said, in the direct way she asked things when she'd decided the moment required directness. Harry thought about it honestly. No, he said. I know what I'm going to find down there. I've been working out the variables for 3 months. I'm not walking in blind. That's not what I mean, she said. I mean, it's Voldemort. Even a piece of him. Harry looked at the fire for a moment. I know what I carry, he said. I've known since October what it means. What happened when he tried to kill me wasn't just luck. What he hit, when he cast that curse, was something it fundamentally couldn't destroy. And that thing is still there. He looked up. I'm not afraid of a fragment of something that already failed to kill it once. Ron looked at him for a long moment with an expression that Harry couldn't entirely read, something that was processing, and deciding, and landing somewhere solid. Right, he said. Then we do it before the end of term. Yes, Harry said. When Quirrell moves. We move first. He went to Kazara the next morning. She was in the clearing, the December air having brought frost that coated the flat rock and everything around it in a thin silver layer. She was indifferent to it, her scales holding heat that made the frost evaporate in a small radius around her bulk. She looked at him when he came in and read the readiness in his face. You're going soon, she said. Before he does, Harry said. I want to get to the stone and neutralize the situation on my terms, not react to his timing. Wise. She paused. Scareth wants you to know that the ICW filing is complete. It's been submitted through the Dragon Nation's formal representative. It cannot be intercepted or suppressed at the ministry level, it bypasses it entirely. Something in Harry's chest released a tension he hadn't fully named. Timeline. The hearing is scheduled for February, she said. 3 months. 3 months. He held that. 3 months and Sirius Black would have a hearing before an international body that Dumbledore didn't control, with evidence that had been preserved outside ministry reach. Good, he said quietly. There's something else. Kazara's voice had shifted slightly, something careful in it. The elders have been discussing what happens after the stone. After Quirrell. Harry looked at her. After, meaning that when you go down those stairs and face what's waiting and come back, there will be a version of this story that Dumbledore writes and a version that is actually true. And those two versions will be, in conflict. He'll try to make it a story about a child stumbling into danger and surviving by luck, Harry said. Yes. And if that story takes hold, it makes everything else easier for him. It gives him a narrative of Harry Potter as fortunate victim, which he can use to justify continued management for the next 6 years. Her amber eyes were very direct. We want to be ready to tell the other story. Harry thought about this. He thought about what it meant to let the world see what actually happened, not the mythology, not the managed version, but the real shape of it. He thought about what Dumbledore had said in the corridor, "You are remarkable." He thought about how remarkable becomes a tool for the person saying it more than it ever benefits the person being called it. When I come back, he said, I'll tell McGonagall the truth. The full truth. Not to Dumbledore, to McGonagall. Kazara tilted her head. Why her? Because she already knows something is wrong and she's been building toward doing something about it for months, Harry said. She needs the specific truth that removes the excuse of uncertainty. Once she has it, she'll act. He looked at Kazara. She's not like him. She just thought she had to be on his side because she didn't think there was another side to be on. Kazara regarded him for a long moment. You have thought about this very carefully. I think about everything carefully, Harry said. I was alone for a long time. Thinking carefully was the main thing I had. A pause. The frost glittered on the clearing's edges, and the forbidden forest breathed around them with its cold, old, patient life, and Kazara looked at Harry with something in her amber eyes that was the accumulated weight of 80 years of a particular kind of love, the kind that does not need to be named to be real. Harry, she said. He looked at her. When you come back from that corridor, she said, come to the forest first. Before you speak to anyone. He held her gaze. He knew what she was saying, she wanted to know he was alive and intact before the aftermath began, before the explanations and the management and the storytelling. She wanted the moment of coming back to belong to her first. He understood this with every part of himself that had learned, over 11 years, what it meant when something treated you as an end in yourself rather than a means to something else. I will, he said. Across the castle, in his office, Dumbledore sat at his desk and looked at a silver instrument on his side table that had been ticking steadily all term and was now, very suddenly, ticking differently. He looked at it for a long moment. The instrument monitored the blood wards at Privet Drive. They were intact. But its secondary function, the function he had set and never expected to need, was monitoring the large-scale magical signature of the entity he had been tracking since 1981, the remnant of a soul fragment that had attached itself to Quirinus Quirrell and had been, up to this point, moving with patience and method. It was no longer moving with patience. Something had changed in its urgency, a spike in the readings, a shift in quality. He looked at it and thought about Harry Potter and thought about the timeline and thought about the very specific problem of a child who had, contrary to all expectation, arrived at Hogwarts not as a blank page to be written on but as something already written, already sure of itself, already in contact with forces that he had underestimated. He had underestimated the dragons. He admitted this to himself in the quiet office with the instrument ticking on the table, because Albus Dumbledore was not a man who lacked the capacity for honest internal assessment, only for honest external expression of it. He had underestimated the dragons' investment, their patience, their organizational capacity, and their reach. He had received the ministry memo in September about the dragon nations filing with the ICW and had known then that the black situation was no longer controllable through the usual channels. He had not acted yet. There were several reasons for this that he found, when he examined them carefully, to be less solid than he'd like. He turned back to the instrument. Quirrell was moving. Not tonight, probably. Soon. He thought about Harry and thought about the stone and thought about the careful architecture of the confrontation he designed, the obstacles, the challenge, the outcome. He had always envisioned Harry going through. He had always known that the boy would be the one to face the mirror. He had designed it that way. What he had not designed for was Harry going through on his own terms. He set the instrument down and looked at the dark window and the stars beyond it and thought, for the first time in a very long time, that the situation was less entirely under his control than he preferred. He picked up his quill. He began, for the first time since September, to revise his plans. Outside the castle, in the Forbidden Forest, a dragon with amber eyes watched the headmaster's office window until the light in it went out. She had been watching it all term. She had noted the nights the light stayed late, and the nights it went early, and the pattern of it, and what the pattern said about a man recalculating. She noted that tonight it went out at 11:30, which was later than usual. She resettled her wings against the frost and looked at the towers and thought about February and the ICW hearing and the end of term and Harry coming back from the corridor. She thought about what came after. It was going to be, she thought, with something that was not quite satisfaction but was close and warm and certain, very interesting. Chapter 5, The enemy declared the night Quirrell moved, it snowed. Harry knew it was happening before he heard anything because the warm thing in his chest, which had become, over the course of the term, something he understood as precisely as he understood his own heartbeat, went from its usual steady presence to something urgent and directional at approximately 11 at night on the 15th of December. He was already awake. He'd been awake since 10, sitting on his bed in the dark with his shoes on and his wand in his hand, watching the dormitory window and the snow beginning outside it, because something in the last 3 days had told him the timing was now and not later. He couldn't have explained the mechanism of that knowing to anyone's satisfaction, but he'd learned not to require a satisfying explanation before trusting it. Ron was awake too. Harry had told him 3 days ago that it would be this week, and Ron had the quality of someone who, once committed to a thing, commits with his whole body. He'd gone to bed fully dressed for 2 nights running and tonight was the third. "It's tonight," Harry said quietly. Ron sat up immediately. No questions, no delay. He'd been waiting for those 2 words and they landed clean. Hermione's dormitory was a different staircase and a castle rule Harry was prepared to work around, but as it happened, he didn't need to. She was already in the common room when they came down, sitting in the chair nearest the door with her bag in her lap and her expression carrying the slightly heightened precision of someone who has been awake for an hour and has used the time productively. She looked up. "I thought it would be tonight," she said. "How?" Ron said. "He left dinner early. His hands were shaking during the whole meal and he kept touching the left side of his head. Whatever is under the turban was agitated." She stood. "I've been reviewing the potion's riddle logic since 9. I have it." Harry looked at them both, Ron's uncomplicated solidity, Hermione's concentrated readiness, and felt something he wasn't going to name right now because there wasn't time, but which he filed carefully. "Let's go," he said. The castle at midnight was a different country from the castle in daylight. The corridors had a quality of genuine ancientness at night, the daytime traffic and noise stripped away, the stones revealing the centuries they'd been standing in, the specific deep cold of a building that has been cold for so long that cold has become one of its properties rather than a condition. The suits of armor caught the torchlight and threw it back at odd angles. The portraits slept in their frames, or pretended to. They moved quickly and without unnecessary sound, which was a thing Harry was good at and which Ron had more natural talent for than his general manner suggested. Hermione was quieter than expected. She had the focus-induced stillness of someone whose mind was running so fast that the body had been deprioritized. The third-floor corridor was ahead. Harry could feel the stone now, or rather could feel the disruption of it, the old magic recognizing his approach the way water recognizes the shape of what moves through it. He pushed the door and it opened without resistance, which meant Quirrell had already been through and left it unlocked behind him, which meant they were behind him in the sequence. Harry moved faster. Fluffy was asleep. Not naturally asleep, the massive three-headed dog was slumped across the trapdoor with the boneless heaviness of something that had been put under, and the sound of small notes still hung in the air, fading. Harry looked at the harp sitting in the corner playing itself and looked at the three enormous sleeping heads and looked at the trapdoor and thought about Quirrell being ahead of them in the sequence and moved. He got the trapdoor open. The drop below was dark. He went first, landing in the devil's snare with the particular experience of something that has read about it extensively and finds the actual encounter slightly more physical than reading suggested. The plant reached for him immediately, and he went still and warm and bright simultaneously, reaching for the old fire and letting it radiate out from his skin, and the plant recoiled. Hermione landed beside him, went rigid with instinct, caught herself and went limp. Ron dropped on Hermione's other side and said something about plants that made Hermione say his name with an entire paragraph's worth of feeling in 2 syllables. They were through. The winged keys were next, a room full of them, all flying, and a broom standing against the wall. Harry was in the air before Ron had fully processed the room. He'd been flying for 3 months and had the instinct now, the particular communication between body and broom that the best flyers had and couldn't entirely teach. He tracked the old key, slightly bent wing, faded blue, through the chaos of the others and had it in 30 seconds. The door opened. "That was fast," Ron said. "I've been visualizing it since October," Harry said, and went through. The chess room stopped them. Not Harry. Harry had known the chess game was Ron's and he stepped back against the wall and watched Ron walk to the board with the specific expression Ron got when he was working, which was very different from his usual face. Focused, quiet, everything else offline. The chess pieces were life-sized and very aware of them. They stirred when Ron approached. The black pieces had the quality of things that have been waiting to be played for months and were ready. "I need to take the position of the knight," Ron said, studying the board. "Ron," Hermione said. "I know." He glanced back at her. "I know what it means. There's no path through that doesn't sacrifice the knight." He looked at Harry. "Get the stone. That's the game." Harry held his gaze for a moment. "I'll come back for you," he said. "I know you will," Ron said easily, and climbed onto the chess piece with the manner of someone mounting a horse rather than preparing to be knocked unconscious by enchanted marble, which Harry found simultaneously alarming and deeply characteristic. "Go." The game began. Harry watched long enough to confirm what he'd known. Ron was extraordinary at this, moving pieces with a speed and precision that suggested he was reading the board several moves ahead at all times, dismantling the opposition's configuration with the efficiency of someone who has been playing his whole life and has finally found a game that matters. He caught Hermione's sleeve and pulled her toward the door. "He'll win," Harry said quietly. "I know," she said, I know that's not what you're worried about," he said. "He'll be fine." She looked at him and then at the door and then at Ron moving pieces across the board like a conductor, and she did the thing where she filed a motion efficiently and stepped through. The troll chamber was already handled. The creature was unconscious on the floor in a way that confirmed Quirrell had come through here first, and the thing riding the back of his skull had made short work of it. Harry stepped past it without ceremony. Snape's potion was next, the riddle room, the bottles on the table, the fire blocking both exits. Harry watched Hermione walk to the table and look at the bottles and look at the flames and begin working through it with a speed that made watching it feel like watching something extraordinary disguised as something ordinary. "Here," she said, "inside 2 minutes. This one." She held up a small bottle. "And this one is for going back." She held up another. "There's only enough for one person forward." "I know," Harry said. She turned to look at him. The purple flames behind her caught the amber of his eyes, and for a moment the two of them stood in the flickering light of an enchanted room in the basement of a school and looked at each other with the particular honesty of people who are about to be separated by something neither can change. "Come back," Hermione said. Not asking. Not pleading. Telling, in the specific way she told things when she meant them absolutely. "Yes," Harry said. She pressed the forward bottle into his hand. Her fingers were cold and very steady. He took it, held it for a moment, and drank it. Cold flooded through him from the throat down, the cold of something very clear and very precise, like thought condensed to temperature. The purple flames parted. He walked through. The last chamber was smaller than the others. It held one thing, the mirror of Eriste, standing in the center of the room with its ornate frame and its dark glass that showed things that weren't there. Harry had read about it. He knew what it did, and he knew why it was here, and he knew what it contained. He also knew it wasn't empty. Quirrell was standing at the mirror with his back to the door, very still, his posture rigid with the specific tension of a man who has been told to do something and cannot. He turned when Harry came in, and his face was, it was a terrible face. Not because of what Quirrell had made of it, but because of what was happening to it from the inside, the consuming occupation of something that needed a body more than the body could sustain. "Potter," Quirrell said. The stutter was completely gone. It had been gone since the troll chamber, Harry guessed, no need for the performance now. "I expected you." He expected you. "I know," Harry said. He walked forward, stopped about 10 feet from Quirrell, and looked at the mirror. He could see himself in it, but not only himself. He could see the reflection of himself pulling something from his pocket, a small red stone, and pocketing it. He kept his face neutral and his breathing even. "Tell me what you see," Quirrell said. "I see myself," Harry said. "Nothing else." Quirrell's jaw tightened. "He says you're lying." "He's welcome to think so," Harry said. The voice that came next was not Quirrell's. It was dry and thin and cold and had the quality of something that has been stretched very far and is held together by will rather than any normal continuity, a voice that was barely a voice, more like a pressure behind the air. It came from the back of Quirrell's head. "Harry Potter," it said. "How disappointing. I expected more theater." Harry looked at Quirrell's rigid back, the turban, the point from which the voice was coming. "You're a piece of something," he said. "A fragment. I don't know why you'd expect theater." A pause. "What do you carry?" the voice said, with an abrupt sharpness to it, not a question so much as an attempt to categorize, the frantic taxonomy of something trying to identify a threat. "I felt it the moment you came in." "What is it?" "Nothing you would recognize," Harry said. "It's too far from what you chose to become." "Let me see your face," it said. "Queerness." Quirrell began to turn. Harry didn't wait. He moved forward and grabbed Quirrell's arm, and the effect was immediate and violent and nothing like he'd expected in its precise details and exactly like he'd expected in its essential nature. The contact hit like a current, the old fire in his chest surging outward through his hands with a force that wasn't destructive in the way spells were destructive. It wasn't aimed. It wasn't a weapon exactly. It was the meeting of two fundamentally opposite things at the point of contact, and the thing that had less substance, less wholeness, less of whatever made a soul, that thing couldn't sustain it. Quirrell screamed. Not Quirrell's voice, the voice underneath it, the cold thin one, rising into something that had frequency and register like pain distilled to sound. Harry held on. His hands blistered, actual heat, actual damage, physical cost, and he held on because letting go was the only thing that cost more. The fire in his chest was not warm now. It was white and vast and very, very old, and it burned where his hands touched Quirrell's skin, and Quirrell's skin burned and crumbled and turned to ash from the point of contact outward, and the screaming built and then, silence. The thing in the room changed immediately. The specific quality of threat, that cold pressure that had been in the air since he'd walked through the flames, lifted like weather breaking. It didn't disappear. Harry could feel it fragmenting, dispersing, the fragment of soul losing its anchor and going somewhere that wasn't here. Not destroyed. Not yet. But no longer here, no longer embodied, no longer able to touch the stone. He stood in the silence with his hands open and looked at them. The blisters ran from the base of his fingers to his wrists, vivid and painful and very real. He closed his hands carefully. The pain was clean, the kind of pain that is simply information rather than commentary. He looked at the mirror. Then he looked away from it deliberately, and looked for the stone. Quirrell's robe had partially disintegrated at the right shoulder. Something small and red and heavy had rolled to the base of the mirror's frame. Harry walked to it, crouched, and picked it up. It was warm in his palm in a way that was completely different from the white fire of a moment ago, older, quieter, the warmth of something that has been storing life for a very long time and is very good at it. He put it in his pocket. He straightened. He stood in the empty chamber with the mirror and the ash on the floor and the cold fire fading from his hands and breathed for a moment, just breathed, letting the body process what had happened. Then he turned and walked back through the flames. Hermione was sitting against the wall of the Riddle room when he came through, her arms around her knees, and she was on her feet before the fire had fully closed behind him. She looked at his hands. "Harry, I'm all right," he said. "Your hands, I know." He looked at them. "The stone is safe. Voldemort's fragment is gone, dispersed, not destroyed, but gone from here." He met her eyes. "We need to go back for Ron." She pulled herself together with the efficiency that was so characteristically her. "Can you?" "Yes," he said, which answered the question she hadn't finished, which was whether he could manage the journey back. The blisters hurt but his hands worked. He was upright and clear-headed and the old fire in his chest was quiet now, settling back to its normal warmth after the expenditure, the way a fire settles after a surge. They went back through the potion room and through the chess room, where Ron was unconscious, as expected, knocked from the horse mid-game, the sacrifice completed, the white pieces cleared to let them pass. Hermione crouched over him immediately and Harry watched the game board for a moment. Ron had won. Of course he had. The black pieces stood in defeat formation, conceded. Ron woke up approximately 90 seconds under Hermione's attention and said, with his eyes still closed, "Did he get it?" "I got it," Harry said. Ron opened his eyes and looked at Harry's hands and said, "Bloody hell," with considerable feeling. "Language," Hermione said automatically, and then looked like she'd surprised herself, and Ron started laughing, and even Harry found the corner of his mouth going, because there was something about coming back from something like that and having the world immediately return to being exactly itself that was both absurd and deeply necessary. He went to the forest first. He told Ron and Hermione to go back to the tower and that he'd be along shortly, and he walked out of the castle's side entrance into the snow-soft quiet of the grounds at 2 in the morning. The snow had stopped. The grounds were white and still and the castle behind him was lit in the warm gold of its own candles. He walked to the tree lane and into the forest and into the clearing, and Kazara was waiting. She had been there since midnight, he could tell. The snow around her flat rock had been melted in a wide radius and refrozen in a smooth shell that suggested several hours of sustained body heat. She stood when he came in. Not the languid repositioning of her usual rest, she stood with immediate attention, reading him across the clearing before he reached the rock. You're injured, she said. My hands, he said. I held on. Show me. He held his hands up. The blisters had already done something unusual in the time since the chamber. They'd started to resolve, not healing exactly but changing quality, the skin beneath them clarifying. He wasn't sure what was happening. He didn't think it was normal. Kazara looked at his hands with an expression that was not alarmed. It was the expression of something that recognized what it was looking at. The old fire, she said. When it burns outward at that intensity it marks you. Temporarily. It will be gone by morning. Good to know, he said. Sit, she said. He sat on the edge of the flat rock, absurdly small against the scale of everything else in the clearing, but the rock was warm from her heat and the warmth was very welcome in the cold December air. She lowered her head to his level and looked at him with amber eyes that had the steady, full attention of something that has been worried and is now doing the work of being less worried. Tell me, she said. So he told her. All of it, the descent, the chambers, Quirrell's face, the voice, the contact and what it felt like, the dispersal. He told it plainly, in the same direct language he used for everything, and she listened without interrupting, which was the highest form of respect available to Kazara. When he finished she was quiet for a moment. The fragment dispersed, she said. Not destroyed. Not yet, he said. No, she agreed. There are others. He made himself into many pieces, over time, and those pieces will be found and dealt with eventually. But that is not tonight's problem. She looked at him. Tonight you prevented a resurrection. Tonight you took the stone before he could use it. That is, not a small thing. I know, he said. Not with arrogance. With the clean acknowledgement of someone who understands what they've done and is not going to pretend they don't. She looked at him for a long moment. Scarith will want to know everything, she said. He'll have it, Harry said. In the morning. And after morning, she said carefully, the story begins. Dumbledore will have a version. You need yours to be already established before his takes hold. Harry nodded. He'd been thinking about this since the chamber. McGonagall, he said. First thing. I go to her before Dumbledore hears I've come back. She'll be awake, Kazara said, and something in her tone suggested this was a confirmed observation rather than a guess. She's been awake all night. She has been awake all night, Kazara confirmed, with the dry certainty of something that has been watching the castle's windows for several hours. There is one light in the staff room that has not moved. It has the quality of a person sitting with something difficult. Harry thought about McGonagall sitting in the staff room through the night with whatever she knew and whatever she suspected and the specific difficulty of a person who has been making a choice for 10 years and is close to making a different one. I'll go to her now, he said. Kazara looked at him. Go, she said. Come back when it's done. He stood from the warm rock. The clearing was cold around him, the frost glittered dark of a forest in December at 2 in the morning. He looked at Kazara, the dark blue-black scales, the vivid amber eyes, the 80 years of particular character that had made her volunteer loudly and insistently for this posting, and felt the warm thing in his chest do something it didn't usually do, which was to express itself as something very close to gratitude. Thank you, he said. She met his eyes. You don't thank family, she said, and it was so simply said and so completely meant that he stood with it for a moment before he turned and walked back through the trees. The staff room light was on. He knocked. There was a pause, the specific pause of someone who was not expecting a knock at 2:30 in the morning and was processing the information, and then McGonagall's voice, come in. She was sitting in the chair nearest the window with a tartan dressing gown over her robes and a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her. She looked at Harry when he came in and the expression on her face did several things in rapid succession, relief, concern, anger not directed at him, and something underneath all of those that was the specific look of a person who has been waiting for something to break and has just heard it break. She looked at his hands. Sit down, Potter, she said, in the voice that meant she was holding herself together with precision. He sat. "Tell me," she said. He told her everything. Not the version he might have told Dumbledore, not the managed version, not the version shaped by what someone needed to hear. He told her the complete and specific truth, beginning with what he knew about the stone and Quirrell and Dumbledore's architecture of the situation, and he told her about Khazara and the Dragon Nations and the Declaration, and he told her what Scarith had told him on the roof of Privet Drive about the night the whole world felt his birthday, and he told her about Sirius Black and the ICW filing and the February hearing and the absence of a trial that should have existed. He told her about the cupboard under the stairs, which she already knew about, but he told her what it had actually been like, in the plain language of someone describing a set of facts rather than performing an emotion about them, and he watched the expression on McGonagall's face do something complicated and very honest. She didn't interrupt him. When he finished, the staff room was very quiet. The cold tea sat on the table. The window showed the grounds in their winter dark, snow-white and still. McGonagall looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at him with her direct, precise eyes, and what was in them was not comfortable to see, because it was a person looking at themselves honestly. "I went to Dumbledore," she said. "The night he left you at Privet Drive. I told him the family was unsuitable. I told him my reservations." A pause. "He told me to trust him. That it was necessary. That you were safe." Her voice was very controlled. "I told myself that he knew more than I did. That there were factors I wasn't aware of." "There were," Harry said. "But knowing more doesn't make the decision right." She held his eyes. "No," she said. "It doesn't." A silence. "The ICW hearing," she said. "February. Is it solid?" The Dragon Nation's representative filed formally. "The goblins have the evidence. It's been submitted through channels that bypass ministry oversight." Her jaw set in the way it set when she had made a decision and the decision was load-bearing. "I will testify," she said. "If they'll have a witness." Harry looked at her. "They'll have you," he said. "Khazara can arrange it." Something moved in McGonagall's expression at the name. She was too professional to show surprise, but it was there, in the slight recalibration, the adjustment. "The dragon in the forest," she said. "Yes." "Flitwick said he thought there was something in the forest," she said. "He's been very careful about it." "He didn't want to," she paused. "He didn't want to say anything until he knew more." "Tell him he can come to me directly," Harry said. McGonagall looked at him across the staff room with the full attention of a very intelligent and very serious person who has recently had their framework significantly rearranged and is doing the rearranging with complete honesty. "You are 11 years old," she said. It wasn't a criticism. It was an observation that contained, somewhere in it, something that was both the acknowledgement of what he was and the acknowledgement of what he should have been allowed to simply be. "I know," Harry said. "This shouldn't have been yours to carry," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it is. So I'm carrying it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood and took his hands and looked at the blisters, which had faded almost entirely in the time since the forest, just as Khazara had said, and turned them over with the careful hands of someone doing an actual assessment. "You'll come to me tomorrow," she said. "For a proper medical check. Poppy should see these even if they're healing." "Yes," Harry said. "And you'll eat breakfast. Properly." He almost smiled. "Yes." She released his hands. She looked at him with her straight, unflinching eyes. "I am sorry, Potter," she said. "Not performed. Not the apology that covers its tracks with explanation. Just the word, direct and complete." "I know," he said. "Do something about it." "Yes," she said, with the voice she used when she intended to mean it. "I will." He was back in the Gryffindor Tower before 4 in the morning. The common room was empty and the fire had burned to coals. He sat in the chair nearest the fire and let the warmth work on the December cold he'd been carrying since the grounds, and he thought about the night's sequence of events with the methodical completeness of someone filing things properly before sleep. The stone was in his pocket still. He'd need to get it to the appropriate people in the morning, not Dumbledore, he'd decided. He'd pass it to Flitwick and have Flitwick broker its return to Nicholas Flamel through channels that Dumbledore didn't control. Flamel deserved to have it returned to him without political interference. He'd made it for himself and his wife, not for a school's defensive infrastructure. Voldemort's fragment was dispersed. Not gone, not permanently resolved, but gone from here, unable to act, unable to recorporealize in the short term. Time had been bought. The war, such as it was going to be, had been delayed. McGonagall had the truth and was going to do something with it. The ICW hearing was scheduled. Sirius Black was 3 months from freedom. He sat in the chair and let the fire's warmth reach him and thought about Scarith on a granite cliff watching the eastern horizon on his 6th birthday, counting days. He thought about Kazara saying you don't thank family in the cold clearing at 2 in the morning. He thought about Ron on the chess piece and Hermione pressing the bottle into his hand with steady fingers. He thought about what it was like to be 11 years old and not alone. He had never been not alone before. He had been with people, technically surrounded by people for 11 years, and had been so entirely alone that the isolation had calcified into part of his structure, the way a tree grows around a fence. He'd thought for a while that the aloneness was just a property of him, something innate, that he was the kind of person who existed adjacent to rather than inside the warmth of other people. He knew now that wasn't true. He knew the difference between being kept out and choosing to stand back, and he knew which one he'd been doing, and he knew which one he was done with. He sat by the fire until the coals died and the tower went dark and cold, and then he went upstairs and lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling for a while. Then he slept. Dumbledore found out in the morning, as Harry had known he would. The sequence was, Madame Pomfrey discovered the chamber had been accessed when she went to check Quirrell's classroom and found it empty. She raised the alarm. The alarm reached McGonagall, who went to Dumbledore with a version of events that was true but selective. She confirmed Harry was safe, she confirmed the stone was secured, she said nothing yet about the larger conversation. Dumbledore came to find Harry after breakfast. Harry was in the library, which was where he'd planned to be, visible, settled, doing something ordinary that made the meeting happen on Harry's terms rather than being summoned to an office. Dumbledore sat across from him with the warmth and the gravity balanced in exactly the precise proportions of someone who is genuinely concerned and also very carefully working out what has been preserved and what has been lost. Harry, he said. I've been told you went into the corridor last night. Yes, Harry said. You should have come to me, Dumbledore said. His voice had the tone of measured disappointment, not heavy, not accusatory, but present, the implication being that trust had been not quite broken. I considered it, Harry said. I decided it would take too long. My door is always open, I know, Harry said. But Quirrell was moving and the timing required moving with it, not around it. He met Dumbledore's eyes. The stone is secured. Voldemort's fragment is dispersed. I'll have the stone returned to Flamel through appropriate channels before the week is out. A pause. Something moved in Dumbledore's expression, the recalibration again, becoming a familiar feature of their interactions. You've moved very quickly, he said. I had good information and time to prepare, Harry said. Both of those came from sources outside Hogwarts. Dumbledore held his gaze. The Dragon Nations. Among others, Harry said. A silence between them that had the quality of two people acknowledging what they both know is happening rather than continuing to pretend they don't. Dumbledore had the capacity for this kind of honesty when there was nothing to be gained by avoiding it. What do you want, Harry? Dumbledore said, and it was the first time he'd asked instead of assuming, and Harry noted the shift. What I've always wanted, Harry said. Which is not to be arranged. He kept his voice even and direct. I know about the prophecy. Not the full text, I'll find that, I expect, when I need to. But I know the shape of what you've built my life around. I know what the blood wards required. I know what you decided was necessary. He paused. I'm telling you that I'm going to make my own choices from here forward. I'm going to learn what I need to learn and face what needs to be faced, but on my terms. Not as a piece on a board. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. You are remarkably informed, he said. I have good friends, Harry said. Some of them are very old. The warmth in Dumbledore's expression did something complicated. It didn't disappear exactly, but it shifted, became something more genuine and less constructed, which Harry found unexpectedly more human than the performance version. I made decisions, Dumbledore said slowly, that were about the greater good and not about you specifically. I have told myself for years that the distinction matters. Does it? Harry said. A long pause. No, Dumbledore said, quietly. I think perhaps it doesn't. Harry looked at him, the brilliant man with the silver beard and the ancient eyes, the man who had calculated the cost of an 11-year childhood and decided it was acceptable and had spent 10 years telling himself the story in which that made him the necessary villain rather than the unnecessary one. He felt, carefully and without indulgence, something that was not forgiveness but was the precursor to the possibility of it, the acknowledgement that the man across from him was not a monster, which in some ways was more complicated. The ICW hearing in February, Harry said. Don't obstruct it. Dumbledore was very still. Sirius Black's case, Harry said. The Dragon Nations have filed through the ICW. The goblins have the evidence. It's going to happen regardless. I'm asking you not to use your ICW position to complicate the proceedings. A long silence. You know everything, Dumbledore said, and it was an accusation. It was something that was almost, very quietly, relief. Not everything, Harry said. But enough. Dumbledore looked at his hands on the table. Something moved through his expression that Harry couldn't entirely read and didn't try to. It was too private and too complicated and it belonged to Dumbledore, whatever it was. I won't obstruct it, he said. Thank you, Harry said, and meant it, and stood, and gathered his books, and walked out of the library. Behind him, Albus Dumbledore sat alone at the table in the morning light and looked at nothing for a very long time. Outside the castle walls, in the forest clearing, Kazara received a message from Scareth that arrived in the old tongue and contained, in summary, the following: the ICW confirmation had come. The hearing was confirmed. The Dragon Nation's formal representative had received, through Goblin channels, the complete record of Peter Pettigrew's movements post-October 31, 1981, including 3 confirmed sightings and a Gringotts account that had been opened in his own name in 1983, which was the kind of error only a person who expected to remain dead made. The evidence was unimpeachable. The second part of Scaretha's message was shorter. Tell him it's real. Kazara looked at the castle towers in the afternoon light. The snow from last night still lay on the grounds in its clean, unmarked white, and the sun was doing what December sun does, thin and gold and not quite warm enough but present, insisting on itself despite the cold. She thought about Harry in the chamber with his hands on Quirrell's skin and the old fire burning outward. She thought about what Scareth had felt in that pulse on Harry's 6th birthday, the deep compressed wholeness of something that had been kept small for years, and she thought about the 11-year-old sitting in the library telling Dumbledore what was going to happen. She thought about what came after this. There was more coming. She knew this the way she knew weather, by the pressure and the direction and the accumulated experience of things that had come before. The soul fragments Voldemort had scattered. The political fractures in the wizarding world that the Declaration had begun and this year would deepen. The gradual unraveling of a narrative that had been carefully maintained for a decade. All of that was ahead. But right now, in the clean December afternoon, a boy had gone into a chamber alone and come back out again, and a man who thought he controlled the story had been told, quietly and without anger, that the story was no longer his to write. That was enough for now. She spread her wings once, a full extension, black-blue against the winter sky, catching the thin December sun, and folded them back. It was enough. Chapter 6, When Mountains Speak February came to London with the particular grey insistence of a month that knows it isn't welcome and doesn't care. The International Confederation of Wizards maintained its primary hearing chamber in a building that existed in the space between a perfectly ordinary Georgian townhouse in Bloomsbury and somewhere else entirely, the kind of architectural arrangement that required the right kind of key and the right kind of knowing to navigate, and that presented its full scale only once you were inside it. The chamber was old. Not Hogwarts old, not the comfortable ancientness of a building that has been lived in for centuries. This was the old of something that had been formal for a very long time, the old of an institution that has outlasted several of the governments that created it and intends to outlast several more. The gallery was full by 8 in the morning. Harry had been there since 7:30, sitting in the section designated for interested parties, which was a diplomatic phrasing that covered everyone from Goblin legal representatives to 3 senior Dragon Nation delegates who occupied the leftmost portion of the gallery in their human-presenting forms, tall, with the particular stillness of things that do not need to perform patience because they genuinely have it. He recognized Scarith without needing an introduction. There was something about the quality of the amber eyes that was unmistakable regardless of the form. Their eyes met briefly. Scarith inclined his head once, very slightly. Harry returned it. Ron was on his left, wearing robes that his mother had clearly pressed 3 times and that he was currently rumpling by existing in them with his usual physical expressiveness. Hermione was on his right with a notebook open on her knee that she wasn't writing in yet but had ready. She'd been in full research mode since December. She had, by Harry's last count, read everything publicly available on wrongful imprisonment under the International Confederation's jurisdiction and several things that weren't easily available, which said something about her relationship with library access restrictions. The Weasley family occupied the 2 rows behind Harry. Molly Weasley had sent him a letter in January that he'd read twice and put very carefully in the same pocket as the grey vellum note from Kazara, which was where he kept things that mattered. Arthur Weasley sat beside her with the expression of a man who works in the ministry and has strong feelings about what the ministry should be doing that it currently isn't. Sirius Black was in a secure waiting room behind the chamber. Harry hadn't seen him yet. This had been a deliberate choice, not because he didn't want to, but because he'd looked at the situation and decided that seeing Sirius for the first time in a corridor before a hearing that would determine his freedom was not how he wanted that to go. He'd wait until after. He'd wait until there was space and time and no legal proceedings surrounding the moment. He sat with this decision and found it solid. The chamber filled further. Ministry representatives arrived and sat in the section designated for member state observers, and Harry watched them arrange themselves with the specific social geography of people who are present but not in control of the proceedings and are unhappy about it. He spotted Fudge, who looked as though he'd been awake for several days and was managing this by means of increasingly frequent recourse to a monogrammed handkerchief. Beside him, a woman with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes, Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, who Harry had read about and whose reputation for direct, uncompromising fairness was apparently genuine enough to have survived multiple ministers. Bones was watching the Dragon Nation delegates with the focused, evaluative attention of someone doing real assessment rather than political performance. The presiding chair was taken by a Norwegian which named Astrid Haraldsson, who had been ICW chief adjudicator for 11 years and had a face that had apparently decided at some point in her 50s that it wasn't going to perform anything it didn't mean. She called the room to order with a single tap of her gavel and the chamber went immediately quiet, because she had the quality of a person whose authority is structural rather than performed and rooms respond to it accordingly. This hearing, Haraldsson said, in English with the flat precision of someone conducting proceedings in their 4th language and not losing anything in the translation, concerns the case of Sirius Orain Black, convicted of the murders of 12 Muggles and 1 wizard, Peter Pettigrew, in October 1981, and sentenced to life imprisonment in Azkaban by the British Ministry of Magic. A pause. This hearing has been called on petition of the Dragon Nation's international representative under Article 47 of the International Confederation's Charter, which provides for review of member state criminal proceedings in cases of alleged procedural violation. Another pause. The specific allegation is as follows, that the individual convicted was not afforded a trial. The room was so quiet that the candles were audible. Bring in the prisoner, Haraldson said. Sirius Black walked in looking like someone who had survived something that most people don't survive and had not entirely decided yet what to do with the fact of his own survival. He was thin in a specific way of someone who has been thin for a long time and whose body has accepted it as a new baseline. His hair was long and hadn't been cut with any particular intention. He walked with the bearing of someone who has not lost their fundamental self to 12 years of Azkaban, which said something extraordinary about what the fundamental self had been to begin with, because Azkaban tried to take that, actively and specifically, and very few people came out of it with it intact. He sat in the chair designated for the accused with the posture of someone in a position they've stopped being ashamed of because shame requires energy they've allocated elsewhere. His eyes moved across the room. They found Harry. Harry had known they would. He'd known it the way he'd known many things this year, not from reasoning exactly but from the accumulated pressure of certainty that certain moments had been building toward. He met Sirius's eyes across the chamber and held them. The expression on Sirius's face in that moment was, Harry didn't look away from it, and he didn't try to manage what he felt looking at it, which was the specific and complicated thing of seeing your own features reflected in a stranger's face, or not quite a stranger, because the man across the room was the person who had been supposed to have him, who had been prevented from it, who had paid for that prevention for 12 years. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. His jaw moved once. His eyes were very bright. Then he turned forward and the hearing began. Haraldson conducted it with the directness that her reputation had promised. The evidence came first. The Goblin legal team presented the documentation with the precise efficiency of people who have been building toward this moment and have prepared accordingly. Ragnarok, the senior partner, delivered each piece with the deadpan certainty of someone who knows their evidence is unimpeachable and is not going to perform drama about it. The Ministry's original conviction record. The arrest record. The absence where a trial record should have been, documented as an absence rather than as a missing document, a crucial distinction that Hermione had explained to Harry in October with a precision that now seemed prescient. The Gringotts account in Peter Pettigrew's name, opened in October 1983, with a full transaction history. The sightings, 3 confirmed, documented through Goblin observation networks that had been tracking Pettigrew's movements since someone had thought to look. Dates, locations, secondary witnesses. The Ministry representatives in the observers section were very still. Fudge had put away the handkerchief and replaced it with an expression of concentrated misery. Then the witnesses. The ICW had permitted 3. The Dragon Nations had nominated Scarif. The Goblins had nominated Ragnarok, who had already spoken in his capacity as evidence presenter and now shifted roles with the smooth efficiency of someone who does many things well. And Harry had asked Hermione to compile the character and supporting witnesses, which she had done with a thoroughness that had produced a list of 8 names, from which the ICW had selected 2. Minerva McGonagall was the first. She walked to the witness position with her straight spine and her precise face and her green robes, and she did not look at Dumbledore, who was sitting in the observers section in a chair that gave the impression of trying to be less central than usual. She answered Haraldson's questions with the directness of someone who has decided what they're doing and has resolved every internal argument about it. She spoke about the night of October 31st, 1981. About what she had seen and what she had been told and what she had not been told. About the family she had surveilled and the concerns she had raised and what had been done with those concerns. She spoke about the address on the Hogwarts letter. She spoke about the December night and the conversation in the staff room, and when she described what Harry had told her, the full version, the details that she had corroborated through her own subsequent investigation, her voice was very controlled and absolutely clear. Did you consider, Haraldson said, at any point over the last decade, that the arrangements in place for this child might be addressed through institutional means? A pause. McGonagall's hands were folded on the ledge in front of her and she looked at them briefly before looking up. Yes, she said. I considered it several times. And you did not pursue it? No, she said. I trusted that the individual responsible for those arrangements had reasons I was not aware of. I told myself that my concerns were less well-founded than his judgment. You were wrong, Haraldson said. It wasn't an attack. It was a statement. Yes, McGonagall said. I was. Haraldson nodded once and moved to her next question. Scareth spoke in the human-presenting form, but the voice was the same, the one that landed behind the ears, slightly, the way a resonance does, the way something that is translating itself from one medium to another always has a quality of translation about it that's different from the original. He spoke for 30 minutes. He spoke about the pulse of July 31, 1982, and what it had communicated, and what the dragon nations had understood from it. He described the nature of the old fire and why it was recognized and what its recognition meant in the context of their law and their history. He spoke about the declaration, not defensively, not as a political act that needed justification, but as a statement of fact. This is what happened, this is what was decided, these are the reasons, they remain sound. He spoke about the 5-year wait with the specificity of someone who wants the room to understand what 5 years of documented restraint looks like, what it cost, why it was chosen. He spoke about Sirius Black. He spoke about what the Dragon Nations networks had found when they began looking, not because anyone had asked them to, but because when you have decided to watch over a child you watch over the whole situation, and the whole situation had, from the beginning, included a wrongfully imprisoned man. He said, "We do not recognize the right of any institution to imprison without trial. We do not recognize the argument of necessity. We do not recognize the greater good as a legal standard when applied to the suffering of a specific individual." He said it clearly and without heat, and the chamber was absolutely silent while he spoke. When he finished, Haraldson looked at the Dragon Nation's delegates for a moment and then at the Ministry section. "Does the British Ministry of Magic wish to respond to any portion of the evidence or testimony presented?" Fudge stood up. He had prepared something. Harry could see the parchment in his hand from across the room. He looked at the parchment and then at the room and then at Haraldson and then at the Dragon Nation delegates and then back at his parchment, and then he put his parchment down. "The Ministry of Magic," Fudge said, "accepts the findings of this hearing and withdraws any objection to a ruling in the petitioner's favor." The chamber made a sound. Not applause, something more complicated, the collective exhale of a room in which something large has moved. Amelia Bones, Harry noticed, was looking at Fudge with an expression that was not quite surprised and not quite approving and contained both. The ruling took 12 minutes. Haraldson delivered it with the same flat, clear precision she'd applied to everything else. Sirius Black had not received a trial. The conviction was therefore not valid under both British Wizarding Law and ICW Article 12. He was released immediately and fully. The question of compensation would be addressed in subsequent proceedings. The question of culpability on the part of the ministry officials responsible for the conviction without trial was referred to British magical law for internal review, which everyone in the room understood was an instruction rather than a suggestion. "The prisoner is released," Haraldson said. Sirius Black stood up. He stood up slowly, the way someone stands when they're not entirely sure the floor will hold them, and then fully, and then he straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and looked across the room at nothing specific for a moment. His hands were at his sides. His expression was doing several things very fast. Harry stood up at the same time, from across the chamber. Their eyes met again. Something passed between them that Harry wasn't going to put language to because language was too slow for it. He walked across the chamber as the room was beginning to move around him, and Sirius walked toward him from the other direction, and they met in the middle of the chamber floor, and Sirius looked at him up close for the first time with eyes that were Prongs' friend's eyes, Lily's friend's eyes, his godfather's eyes, and said in a rough voice, "You look like James." "I know," Harry said. "But I have her eyes." Sirius's mouth did something complicated. "Yeah," he said, barely audible. "You do." Harry looked at him, the thin, scarred, difficult-surviving man in front of him, and thought about the warm thing in his chest that had started on his 6th birthday in a cupboard under a staircase and had led, through 5 years of Scareth watching and Kazara waiting and goblins filing and a term of Hogwarts and a December night in an underground chamber, to this specific corridor in this specific chamber on this specific morning. He thought, this is what it was building toward. He didn't hug Sirius, not there, not in the chamber floor with the whole gallery watching. That was for later, for somewhere private with space and time around it. But he held the man's gaze and let the gaze say what it needed to say, and Sirius held it back, and something was completed that had been incomplete for 12 years. "I'm going to need somewhere to stay this summer," Harry said. Sirius blinked. Then he laughed, a short, slightly broken sound, surprised out of him. "Yeah," he said. "You can do that." Yeah. The aftermath had the quality of things that have been wound tight for a long time and are now being allowed to run out their tension. The ministry was in the careful chaos of an institution processing accountability. Fudge had made his concession partly from political calculation and partly, Harry suspected, from the specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding something together by will alone and has decided the holding isn't worth the cost. Bones was already in conversations with the ICW about the review process. The question of Bartemius Crouch Sr., who had signed off on the Azkaban transfers that had resulted in Sirius's imprisonment, was a matter for that process. The Daily Prophet ran the story with the specificity of journalists who have been handed something too large to ignore and can't find the right frame for it. The first article was accurate in the facts and confused in the interpretation, which was probably the best anyone could hope for at this stage. Dumbledore had not spoken during the hearing. He had sat in the observers section with his hands folded and listened, and at the end he had stood and left without speaking to anyone, and Harry had watched him go and had thought about the conversation in the library in December, the moment when Dumbledore had said "I won't obstruct it" and had meant it. He had meant it. That mattered. It didn't resolve everything, but it mattered. Harry found Flitwick in the corridor outside the chamber while Ron was showing Sirius that he wasn't a ghost and Hermione was organizing everyone's coats. Flitwick looked up at him with the bright dark eyes that always gave the impression of seeing several things at once. He had, Harry knew, filed testimony to the Goblin legal team in writing rather than in person, a careful statement about what he had observed at Hogwarts and what he had subsequently come to understand. "Thank you," Harry said. Flitwick studied him for a moment. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, in the plain, direct tone he used when he meant something. "I suspected things I didn't act on." "You acted when you could," Harry said. "The floor was laid for some time before I stepped onto it," Flitwick said, which was the kind of precise understatement that contained a whole landscape. He looked at Harry for a moment. "Your wandless work this year," he said. "Has it continued to develop?" "Yes." "I want you to come to me over the summer," he said. "Not for lessons exactly. For conversations. There is a tradition of magic that predates wand standardization that I understand better than most people currently practicing." He paused. "I think it may be relevant to your situation." Harry looked at him. "The half-goblin tradition," he said. Flitwick's eyes widened slightly, then, very quickly, resettled. "You are extraordinarily well informed," he said, with the tone of someone who has been surprised and is being honest about it. "I have good sources," Harry said. "And I've been reading." "Yes," Flitwick said. "I imagine you have." He studied Harry with the warm, bright attention that was one of his most genuine qualities. "The conversation I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "would include what I know about magic that doesn't flow through a wand. About what it does and where it comes from and what happens when someone with your particular foundation begins to understand it deliberately." "I want that," Harry said immediately. Flitwick nodded once. "Summer, then." "All right." He moved off down the corridor with his small, precise steps, and Harry watched him go and thought about the next year and the year after that and the years after that, the accumulation of them, the learning in them, the people who were going to be in them. He thought about what Scareth had said a year ago on a neighbor's rooftop: "Learn what they offer. Take what is useful." He thought about what Kazara had said last night, before they'd come to London, when he'd gone to the clearing to tell her the schedule and she'd looked at him across the frost-glittered dark and said, in the dry voice that was her specific form of warmth, "You are ready for what comes next." I am going to say that now because what comes next will not always feel like you are ready for it. He'd said, "What comes next?" And she'd said, more. Just that. More. With the particular completeness of something that doesn't need to list its contents to communicate their weight. He'd stood in a clearing and looked at her against the winter dark and felt the warm thing in his chest doing its quiet, steady thing, not urgent now, not building, just present, the way it had been present since he was 6 years old in a cupboard, and something enormous looked at him in a dream and didn't look away, and thought, yes. More. They went to lunch, all of them, the collection of people that had accumulated around Harry across the year like things that find their natural place. Sirius sat across from him in a corner booth of a Muggle restaurant near Bloomsbury that Ron had chosen by the principle of finding the place with the most food visible through the window, and ate 2 full plates of something and a dessert, and then looked at the dessert menu again with the expression of a man who has been in Azkaban for 12 years and is currently discovering that treacle tart is available. Have the treacle tart, Harry said. Sirius looked up. How did you were looking at it like it had personally done you a favor, Harry said. Sirius ordered the treacle tart and the chocolate cake and ate both with the focused, uncomplicated joy of someone experiencing a simple good thing after a very long time without simple good things. Harry watched him across the table and thought about all the versions of the future that had been possible and which one had been arrived at, and thought about the cupboard and the birthday and the amber eyes and the dream, and found that the sequence made, in its way, a kind of sense. Ron was arguing with the twins about something involving an enchantment and a Muggle bus that Harry had a feeling he didn't need the details of. Hermione was talking to Arthur Weasley about the ICW's procedural charter with the intensity of a person who has finally found an adult who finds the same things interesting she does. Molly Weasley kept putting things on Harry's plate, bread, then a second bread, then something warm that she said was a charm she'd worked on his food, which he didn't examine too closely but ate anyway because Molly Weasley had a quality about her that made eating the bread feel both inevitable and correct. McGonagall was not there. She'd gone back to Hogwarts directly after the hearing, but she'd stopped Harry on the way out of the chamber and had said, quietly and without ceremony, I've written to the Board of Governors about arrangements for next year. There will be changes. Harry had looked at her. The Dursleys will not be an option, she said. I've seen to it. She'd paused. You'll have a proper guardian, once the paperwork is processed. He'd looked at Sirius, who was 20 feet away being given a very firm handshake by Arthur Weasley. Yes, McGonagall had said, following his gaze. That should resolve itself now. He'd nodded and she'd nodded and they'd understood each other without needing more than that, which was, he thought, how a genuine conversation between two people who respected each other actually worked. The lunch extended into the afternoon. Outside the window the grey February light did its best and the London street went about its business with total indifference, and inside the restaurant the table was loud and warm and full of the overlapping conversations of people who have come through something together and are now on the other side of it, processing what the other side feels like. Sirius looked across the table at Harry at some point in the middle of a conversation he'd been having with Ron about Quidditch and Harry had been listening to while also watching Hermione and Arthur Weasley discover mutual enthusiasm for bureaucratic reform. Can I ask you something? Sirius said. Yes, Harry said. The dragons. He paused, choosing words. What Scareth said in there, about the pulse, about watching you since you were 6. Is that, he stopped again. Real? Harry said. Yes. Sirius looked at him for a moment. So you've had, people. This whole time. In a way, Harry said. Not the kind that could come to the house. But yes. Sirius absorbed this with a complicated expression, something that was relief and grief simultaneously. The specific combination you get when you learn that someone you were afraid was alone was not entirely alone, and you can feel grateful for that and devastated by what still wasn't there at the same time. I should have been there, Sirius said. Flat, simple, load-bearing. Yes, Harry said. He didn't soften it and he didn't elaborate. It was true and Sirius deserved to have the truth plainly. You should have been. You weren't. That's done. He looked at Sirius steadily. What's not done is what comes after. Sirius met his eyes. So, Harry said. What comes after? Sirius was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, something changed in his face, the particular shift that happens when a person decides to stop surviving something and start living after it instead. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a decision made visible. I have a house, he said. It's terrible. It hasn't been lived in properly in years, and there's a portrait in the hall that I'm not looking forward to dealing with. He paused. But it's mine. And it's big enough. Big enough for what? Harry said. Sirius looked at him. For a kid who needs somewhere to be, he said. Harry looked back at him, and the warm thing in his chest that had been waiting 6 years to find this specific thing had found it, and he let it, and it settled. Right, Harry said. He went back to the forest that evening. It was later than he'd planned. The afternoon had run long, and the journey back to Hogsmeade had been complicated by the twins discovering that Muggle buses went to places they found interesting, and by the time he slipped into the clearing the February dark had fully arrived and the trees were the deep, indistinct shapes of winter forest at night. Kazara was on her rock. She turned her head when he came in. Well, she said. He's free, Harry said. Full exoneration. The ministry conceded before the ruling. Something happened in Kazara's eyes, the amber brightening briefly, the pupils shifting. She was quiet for a moment. And, she said, reading the quality of his face. He has a house, Harry said. I'm going to live there this summer. The quiet in the clearing had its own texture, the cold winter air and the dark and the old trees and the warmth radiating from the rock and from Kazara herself, and Harry stood in the middle of it and felt, in the specific and complete way of something that has been building for years and has arrived, full. Not happy exactly, or not only. Something larger than happy, the thing that happy is a subset of. The thing that comes from a sequence of events resolving into their intended shape. Good, Kazara said. He walked to the rock and sat on its warm edge and looked up at the sky through the gap in the canopy where the stars were visible. February stars, cold and clear. Flitwick wants to work with me over the summer, he said. The pre-Wand tradition. He thinks it's relevant. It is, Kazara said. You know about it? Scarith knows about it, she said. It predates the wand tradition by several thousand years, and it shares more with what the old fire does than with what your school teaches. Flitwick is one of 3 wizards currently living who have the lineage and the knowledge to guide it. She paused. He should have found you sooner. He's finding me now, Harry said. She made the sound that was her version of conceding a point. They sat in the winter dark for a while without talking, which was a thing Harry had learned that he could do with Kazara. Inhabit silence without it being absence, without either of them needing to fill it. She had 80 years of understanding that presence didn't require noise, and he had 11 years of a different kind of understanding of the same thing. After a while he said, What's coming, Kazara? Tell me the shape of it. She was quiet for a moment. Thinking, or choosing, or both. The soul fragments, she said. There are several. We know of at least 4. Some are objects. Some are, more complicated. They will need to be found and destroyed, and the process of finding them will not be simple and will not be without cost. I know, he said. There are people in positions of power who served Voldemort who have not been identified or held to account, she said. Some of them are in positions from which they can cause significant harm. The Malfoy family. Others. I know that too. The prophesy, she said. You said you knew the shape of it. A child born as the 7th month dies, Harry said. The power the Dark Lord knows not. Neither can live while the other survives. He'd found the full text in November, through a route that had required some creative thinking about the Department of Mysteries archive access, and had read it in the patient, flat assessment way he read difficult things. The power he knows not, he said. You think it's what I carry. We're certain of it, Kazara said. The old fire. The love magic. The specific kind of wholeness that creates a frequency nothing fractured can survive. She paused. He will come back. Not this year. Not soon. But he will come back, and when he does, I'll be ready, Harry said. Not bravado. Not performance. The plain statement of fact that it was, a person who has spent a year learning what they are and what they carry and what that means, arriving at the logical conclusion with the same clean directness they apply to everything else. Yes, Kazara said. You will. Because of you, he said. And Scareth. And everyone who decided a 6-year-old in a cupboard was worth watching. She looked at him with the amber eyes that had been watching the castle towers since September, that had been watching the world since long before he was born. Because of you, she said. We watched. You became. Those are different things. He thought about this. Will you always be here, he said. Not the anxious version of the question. Just the question. I am stationed here, she said, with the affectionate exasperation of someone describing a decision they made emphatically and stand by completely. I volunteered very insistently. Scareth said that. Scareth says many things. She tilted her head. Some of them are true. Harry almost smiled. Will you always be here, he said again, more specifically. She looked at him for a long moment. Until you don't need me to be, she said. And after that, probably also. He looked up at the February stars through the gap in the trees and let that settle in the warm place in his chest where it was going to live. He was back in the castle before curfew. He went to the common room, which was in its late evening state, a handful of older students working, the fire going well, the specific warm noise atmosphere of a room that has been lived in for long enough to feel like it belongs to the people in it. Ron and Hermione were in their usual chairs. Ron had his chess set out and was playing against himself, which he did when he was processing something. He looked up when Harry came in. Well, he said. All good, Harry said. Serious? Free. Proper. He's going to Grimmauld Place to start sorting it out. Ron nodded, satisfied, and moved a piece on the chessboard. Your summer's sorted then. My summer's sorted, Harry said. Hermione looked up from her book. She was already reading something about the ICW's jurisdictional history, which said everything about her approach to emotional processing. How are you, she said. He thought about the honest answer. He looked at the fire and at his two best friends and thought about the year, Kazara in the clearing, Scareth on the roof, the chamber and Quirrell's disintegrating hands and the white fire and the mirror room and McGonagall in the staff room at 2 in the morning and Sirius across the hearing chamber and the lunch and the treacle tart and the summer that was coming and the years after it and the thing he carried and the people around him and what all of it added up to. Good, he said. I think I'm actually good. Hermione looked at him for a moment, and whatever she was reading in his face satisfied her internal assessment, because she nodded once and went back to her book. Ron moved another piece and said, without looking up, you know what's tomorrow? What? First Quidditch practice before the Hufflepuff match. He looked up and grinned, the uncomplicated, genuine grin that Harry had first seen on a train in September and had found unexpectedly easy to be around. Wood's going to run us till we drop. Good, Harry said. You say that now, I mean it, Harry said. I want it. And he did. He wanted all of it, the practices and the matches and the lessons and the arguments in the common room and the meals at the long table and the mornings at the lake and the sessions with Flitwick and the visits to the clearing and the coming years with Sirius in the terrible house that needed to be made livable and all of it, the full, complicated, demanding, worthwhile entirety of it. He sat down in his chair by the fire. He was 11 years old and the world was very large and very full, and somewhere in a valley between 3 countries the dragon nations were breaking down the summit camp and going back to their territories, and somewhere in a Georgian townhouse in Bloomsbury an ancient creature in a human-presenting form was writing a letter to someone who had been waiting to receive it, and in Azkaban the wardens were processing the paperwork for a prisoner who was no longer a prisoner, and in a staff room. In a Scottish castle a woman with a straight spine was writing a letter to a board of governors, and in the forbidden forest a young dragon with black-blue scales and vivid amber eyes was watching the castle towers in the February dark and thinking about what came next. More, she'd said. And more was coming. And Harry Potter, who had never been nothing, who had been something very specific and very certain from the moment he was born and all the way through the cupboard and the birthday and the dream and the school and the chamber and the hearing and all of it, sat in his chair by the Gryffindor fire and was exactly himself. Not what anyone needed him to be. Not the symbol. Not the pawn. Not the boy who lived in the way that phrase had been getting used, as a story told by people who needed a story. Just Harry. And that, finally, was enough. Above the castle, in the February dark, a dragon spread her wings once, the full span of them, catching what starlight there was, the black-blue scales showing their hidden colors at the edges, purple and green, and held the extension for a long moment. Then she folded them and settled back onto her rock and looked at the tower window where a light was still on. She stayed until the light went out. Then she closed her amber eyes, and the forest breathed around her, old and patient and very much alive, and the stars moved overhead in their slow indifferent arcs, and the world turned, as it always had, toward morning.